Board of Inquiry into the Hazelwood mine fire is now in session.
Good morning. This morning we move into the area of communications, and we have two expert witnesses who've been retained by the inquiry, and it's proposed to call them concurrently and to have them give their evidence together. So I call Jim McNamara and Lachlan Drummond. If you could come forward, please.
Please state your full name.
James Raymond McNamara.
Please repeat after me. I do solemnly and sincerely declare and affirm.
I do solemnly
and
sincerely
declare
and confirm
that the evidence I shall give
to
this Board of Inquiry will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Please state your full name.
Lachlan Hugh Drummond.
Please repeat after me. I do solemnly and sincerely declare and affirm.
I do solemnly and sincerely declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
to
this Board of Inquiry will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Good morning, gentlemen. What I propose to do this morning is to take it in turn with each of you to lead some evidence about your qualifications and experience and go to the report that each of you has provided. And then I will go to a joint report that you prepared together earlier this week, and we'll have a discussion about each of those three documents. Professor McNamara, if I could begin with you, can you please state your full name and your address?
James Raymond McNamara.
And you are a Professor of Public Communications at the University of Technology, Sydney.
That is correct.
You've prepared a report for the inquiry.
Yes.
And you have a copy of it there. Since preparing that report, you've been provided with some additional witness statements and attachments to those statements, specifically a statement of Marita Tabane, the Chair of the Emergency Management Joint Public Information Committee, a second statement of Stephen Harkins, the Director of People, Culture and Environment from GDF Sewers Hazelwood, and also a statement of John Mitchell, the Acting Chief Executive Officer of the Latrobe City Council. Having had the opportunity to read that material quite recently, are there any changes that you wish to make to your report?
There's no substantial change in the conclusions I've drawn. There are a number of specific points that I would identify there's been additional information I didn't have at the time, but they don't change the overall conclusions we've drawn.
Right. Would you like to go through those in your report, or are you happy to just acknowledge that you now have additional information?
I'm happy to acknowledge, and I think it'll come out in questions where I would concede some points and argue others.
Right. Before I ask you to adopt your report, I should ask you a little bit about your ability to express opinions on matters of communication. You've told us that you're the Professor of Public Communication at University of Technology, Sydney. That's a position you've held since 2007?
Yes.
And in terms of academic qualifications, you have a Bachelor of Arts, majoring in Journalism and Media Studies.
Yes.
You also have a Master of Arts by Research in Media Studies, which you obtained from Deakin University.
Yes.
And most recently, a Doctor of Philosophy in Media Research from the University of Western Sydney.
That's correct.
And you obtained that qualification in 2005. From interest, what was the subject of your dissertation?
My dissertation was gender representations in the media and the power to influence attitudes.
You have worked in a range of public relations and media roles, starting as a journalist with Queensland Country Newspapers. You had a public relations role with the Australian Army in the mid-1970s. have worked in public relations with the National Farmers Federation for some years, and then in the mid-1990s set up your own consultancy, Karma International. What was the nature of that business?
That business was, the name stood for Computer-Aided Research and Media Analysis. It was a specialist research firm identifying the effectiveness of communication campaigns.
And then you worked for a couple of years as Group Research Director with Media Monitors.
Yes, I sold the company to Media Monitors.
And continued working there for a couple of years before taking up your current position.
That's correct.
You also have a number of publications that are listed in your curriculum vitae. Most recently, a book called Journalism and PR, Unpacking Spin. And there is also a book that you have produced. I can just...
21st Century Media Revolution, I think.
Yes, and there's a public communications handbook that you've also authored. Now, returning to your report, with the qualification that you now have had access to some information that was not available when you first prepared your report, is your report true and correct?
Yes.
And are the opinions expressed in it opinions that you honestly hold?
Yes.
I tender that if I could. Your turn now, Mr. Drummond. Again, I'll ask you to state your full name and your address.
Lachlan Hugh Drummond.
And you are a lead author, research and strategy for a report that has been prepared for the board.
Yes.
And you're currently employed with a consultancy called Red Handed. What's the nature of that consultancy?
I'm the Strategic Director at Red Handed Communications Group. Red Handed specialises in communicating with regional and rural audiences. It was founded on the notion that regional and rural audiences exhibit different values, attitudes and behaviours, and therefore in order to communicate to those audiences you need to understand those, and a better understanding of them enables us as communicators to communicate and do what we do well with those audiences.
Now, in terms of your formal qualifications, you have an honours degree, a Bachelor of Arts from Monash University, majoring in Media Studies and Visual Arts, and you've also since obtained a Master of Marketing from Monash University. Your employment has involved about 20 years of experience in private sector research, strategy and communications. How long have you been in your current role?
I've been engaged by Red Handed since about 2008.
And you are also teaching market research at Deakin University?
That's right. I've lectured in in communications at Monash University, and I've lectured only just recently in market research and communications at Deakin University.
And before taking up your role with Red Handed, you were Group Director and Head of Strategy at Newspol.
That's right. I was the Head of Strategy for Newspol. Newspol's best known for its public opinion polling research.
Yes, I think we're all familiar with Newspol. And you also have prepared a report for the inquiry. It's titled Evaluation of the Communications to Affected Communities During the Hazelwood Coal Mine Fire. You also have been provided this week with some information that's come to the inquiry since you produced your report. Mr Harkin's second statement, statement of Ms Tabane and a statement of John Mitchell. Have you had an opportunity to read through that material? Having had access to that additional material, are there any changes that you would like to make to your report? Are there any other corrections that you wish to make?
No.
Is your report true and correct?
Yes.
And are the opinions expressed in it opinions that you honestly hold?
Yes.
Thank you. If I could tender that. Thank you, Your Honour. Now, to complete the set of documentation, earlier this week the inquiry asked both of you to confer and to identify areas on which you agreed, areas on which you didn't agree, and to prepare a joint report that focused on 3 issues. Whether you consider that government departments engaged in appropriate communication strategies during the fire, whether you considered that GDF sewers had engaged in appropriate communication strategies during the fire, and lastly, what steps you considered could have been taken to improve the communication strategies of any parties during the fire. You did that and produced a joint report, which is a document of 3 pages. Have you both read that joint report?
Yes.
And do each of you adopt it as a statement as your joint report?
Yes.
I tender that also, Your Honour. And if I could tender it with the protocol that was provided, that I understand has also been provided to the parties. Now, before I proceed to ask a few more questions, there is a letter that was sent to the inquiry by the Victorian Government Solicitor's Office yesterday that identifies a number of factual matters that bear on the opinions expressed by Professor McNamara and Mr. Drummond. Yes, if it could be part of Exhibit 52. The letter is a convenient way of identifying a number of factual matters that the state and its agencies say bear on the opinions expressed. The fact that we've tendered it should not be taken as an indication that Council assisting agree with everything in the letter, and particularly not the statement that in the period 10 to 14 February there was a widely held view that there would not be a crisis affecting the population of Morwell. Our submission will be that it was known from at least the 12th of February that the fire would be burning for a month and would have significant effects on the population of Morwell. But I tender that statement, and I'm grateful to the state for having done that work in advance. It will certainly ease the proceedings this morning. Now, before we move into a discussion of communications that occurred during the fire at the Hazelwood mine in February and March of this year, I'd like to focus on best practice in crisis communication. Each of you was asked to write about that in your reports. And I thought a good place to start might be in identifying the different types of crises about which communication might be required. Professor McNamara, at paragraph 8 of your report, you identify 7 different kinds of crises. So if we can go to paragraph 8, there are natural crises, which include accidentally started fires. There are technological failures. There are confrontation crises, crises caused by malevolence, such as terrorism or sabotage, and I suppose in that, no, we're not looking at the right page, page 8.
Page 8.
Yes. Crises caused by malevolence, in which I expect we could include arson, and then crises caused by systemic issues, crises caused by deception, and crises caused by management misconduct. Do those 7 types of crises fall into 2 separate groups?
I'm not sure what you mean by 2 separate groups.
Well, you draw these from some writings on something called situational crisis communication theory.
Fault, you mean?
And there are 4, the first 4 are crises that are not the fault of the person who's managing it. and then the 5th, 6th and 7th fall into a different
Yes.
category. Why are these classifications important when it comes to crisis communication?
Crises in which there is no fault on the part of any of the organisations involved, usually there's more public understanding and more public sympathy for the organisation. The organisation may even be the victim. In the latter, the organisation is at fault in some form or another, and there is often great distrust and antipathy towards the organisation. The only point I'd add is that crises have a way of never staying within one of those categories, and crises tend to evolve and emerge, and I think this happened in this case where it started out as a bushfire, which might be a natural crisis, but then turned into a mine fire and then evolved onwards.
So are you able to place the Hazelwood mine fire into any of these categories, accepting what you just said about the crisis evolving as it went on?
It's a difficult one, and I have sympathy for those managing it. It was clearly a natural crisis in the terms of the bushfire that occurred. Then it spread to more of an industrial issue when the mine fire occurred.
Which would bring it into the second category, technological failures.
There was rumours or speculation on arson, which takes it into malevolence. But then what evolves, and this is where it becomes a matter of some opinion, but to what extent has management adequately prepared and adequately dealt with it, and to what extent do the authorities adequately deal with it, so it morphs into potentially criticism of management's handling of it, so it can end up becoming a human crisis and a management crisis. And crises have a way of being slippery and moving on. It requires a great deal of deftness on behalf of management to address that.
Mr. Drummond, you refer in your report to something called chronic technological crises. What are they, and did we have one here?
I think what happened here was a crisis that started as a bushfire, but could probably be more accurately characterised as a chronic technological disaster, or a disaster that led to a long-term health and anxiety impacts for the local community. So what started as a bushfire, in fact, evolved into something akin to a chronic technological disaster. The literature on chronic technological disaster, though somewhat out of the scope of this report, talks about and has a whole range of ways of dealing with these sorts of issues. The reason I cited chronic technological disasters in this report is that I think that that's a more accurate classification of the nature of the problem that that affected communities were dealing with.
So as distinct from a natural disaster?
As distinct from a natural disaster. And if I could add, I think one of the problems that we'll get to was that what I would call an inaccurate classification, such as to classify it as a bushfire and roll out protocols associated with bushfire, meant that the response didn't quite fit the nature of the crisis, and I think that contributed to some of the problems we'll discuss later on.
Yes, so in terms of best practice, a key feature of implementing an effective crisis communication strategy is correctly framing the crisis that you're dealing with.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, agreed.
And it's my opinion that the framing, whilst correct perhaps at the start, didn't quite fit over the course of the event.
Again, at paragraph 8 of your report, Professor McNamara, you talk at the bottom of the page about key factor in crisis communication is that preparation, response and recovery initiatives are far more important. Now, we've been dealing with emergency management plans and protocols in some detail in this inquiry, and we're familiar with those 3 stages of emergency management. So I'd like to talk through each of those stages with each of you, starting with the preparedness or preparation stage. What, Professor McNamara, is best practice in terms of preparing for communication during a crisis?
Well, on pages 9 and 10, I've outlined a number of very specific steps that are in sort of most of the best practice models. And the first one of those is scenario development, where you identify possible risks and you carry out a risk assessment of both their potential seriousness and potential probability. Then you do a series of preparation steps, and some of that was certainly done, but it goes all the way through from having a crisis teams on standby, having protocols, all the way through to training. And then there's other steps such as what's technically called networking and bridge building, but that's setting up the relationships well in advance with local, if you identify a risk in a particular area, groups in the community, leaders in the community, local newspapers, having very clear relationships in advance that can be called upon. And it disturbed me in some of the reading I did to see people were around the 20th of February and after saying they were identifying leaders in the community. Well, that would normally be done in a crisis plan strategy long before. So those are some of the key steps, and all of the models absolutely emphasise preparation. And in fact, most people say crisis communication and management is an iceberg, that 80% or 90% is below the surface and done in advance and then rolled out at the time.
Is this level of preparation a reasonable thing to expect of a government agency or a private company, given that emergencies are inherently unexpected and unplanned events?
Well, when you say, I'm careful about the word unexpected, because I think open-cut mines, brown coal, bushfire areas, any risk assessment, very close to a town, to me, I'm not a scientist or a technician, but that just spells, and the fact there's been coal mine fires around the world and in this particular mine, says that there is a risk. Now, I can't assess the total probability of it, but one would think you would say things could happen at this mine. There could be a fire, and a coal mine fire is usually a problem. So I would think it could have been identified. Is it reasonable for organisations to do so? Absolutely. Government departments, in fact, are becoming, generally speaking, quite good. We've seen this with floods and bushfires in this state and in Queensland, where they have great amounts of planning and preparation, and we're seeing it with corporations. I work with many companies over the years, including airlines, and they even go as far as rehearsing their crisis plans and actually involving their staff in real-time rehearsals to debug it and find the problems that occur, because they know they have to work under incredible pressure at the time.
What do you see as the relationship between crisis communication preparation and the preparedness aspect of emergency management generally? Are they separate or connected?
One fits within the other, and there is a tension in that, because in a crisis, clearly the operational and technical responsibilities are paramount. I mean, putting the fire out, we'd all agree, I think, is the most important thing. And so it's very easy that the communication has to fit within the overall crisis response. But it's very easy for that to fall lower down the list in the wake of technical issues, science, operational issues, legal issues, and so forth. And so there is both a dovetailing but also a tension between the two, and we do see quite often communication is sort of follows protocols but doesn't get down to the very hands-on, very human level of communication that we might talk about.
Mr. Drummond, a theme that comes through very strongly in your report is the importance of knowing the community that you are communicating with. Why is that such a critical feature of communication, particularly in regional areas?
Well, I think in order to communicate to any audience, you need to understand that audience. An understanding of that audience is more likely to contribute to that audience respecting, trusting, listening to the communications. My sense is that throughout this crisis, the authorities and individuals, whilst doing their best and working under difficult circumstances, didn't fully appreciate the socioeconomic status, the values, the attitudes, and even the needs of the community. And so what I contend is that there's a disconnect between the communications that were given and what was in fact received. And I draw a distinction between information and communicating. And my sense is that what we saw here was a hell of a lot of information going out, but not a lot of communicating.
That's a distinction I'll come back to in a while. Since we're dealing with the preparation phase of crisis communication, what can be done in preparing to be ready to communicate during a crisis to ensure that you know the community that you're having to communicate with?
So in this case, I would have thought that it would be standard practice, or perhaps best practice, to be prepared by understanding the demographic and social characteristics of the community, say of Morwell and the immediate surrounds, I would have thought it would be critical and important to build contacts in advance of any crisis, contacts within the community leaders, develop networks, have relationships with editors and publishers of the local paper, and in effect build a team that in the event of a crisis you can rally quickly, with whom you have relationships. So I think authorities, if I was to make recommendations on best practice in communicating to this audience, it would be built around understanding the audience and having networks set up and established so that in the event of a crisis, you're ready to deploy very quickly.
Is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I think you were going to come back to the information versus communication issue, I think, and that's something I would like to comment on at some point.
Yes, I certainly will come to that. If we can move to the response phase, and again, if we can start with your report, Professor McNamara, at page 11, you start with a golden rule for all communication once a crisis occurs. What's that rule?
Be quick, be consistent, be open. Openness is a very, very key fundamental, and that again is a challenging thing because information is often coming in real time, but it requires a constant being open and standing up and talking to people and engaging with people.
Now, golden rule is very simply stated. Another rule perhaps is that silence is not golden in a crisis.
No, and this is where it gets to communication, is that organisations often put out a lot of information, but communication is not only what you say, it's what you do, it's visibility. People take meaning out of those kind of things. So attending or not attending meetings, being present or not being present, having out-of-towners versus locals who know, these are all communication, not just the technical information that's distributed, and certainly not being present can speak volumes in many cases. It's interpreted as silence, and silence tends to be interpreted as guilt. Rightly or wrongly, that's how humans work.
And there's a table you've provided at the bottom of that page 11 that has a hierarchy, I suppose, or a spectrum of different approaches to a crisis. Could you talk us through those different approaches?
Yes, this is built from several hundred, interviewing people who've been in organisations in several hundred crises, and has constructed this table. And as you can see, by a silence not being visible, not being present, is usually, even if the organisation is completely guiltless, it's generally interpreted very negatively. Remember, we're talking here about people's perceptions. Denial can work, but only if it's absolute watertight argument. Denial normally doesn't work. Excuses aren't taken well. So saying, well, it was a bushfire and it was I see the word unprecedented used a lot in all of the documents I've read, and I have to challenge that, because how can it be unprecedented given that there has been fires before? There's bushfires in Australia regularly. Brown coal catches fire easily. I mean,
that's why we dig it up, yes.
I mean, certainly it was foreseeable. Justification, as you move down, you get towards justification, and that certainly is credible evidence.
And what's the distinction between excuses and justification?
Excuses often is deflecting blame. Justification is saying we did everything that we had to do, we were fully prepared, and in spite of that, we still had this problem, and justification can work. The last one causes confusion. Confession is translated out of different languages. In apology, it's more the Greek apologia, rather than outright begging forgiveness type of apology, but it's owning up and saying we're really sorry, not admitting legal liability, but saying we're very concerned for the community, we share the problem, and we're here with you. And that's the approach that often works best of all. I mean, if an airliner falls out of the sky and there's no fault of the airline, they still have got to be awfully sorry about it, even though they would not take legal liability for it necessarily. And so best practice tends to lean towards either justification or deep sympathy and empathy with the community and sharing the problem and helping fix it very quickly.
Mr. Drummond, in your report, there are some aspects of communication during a crisis that you you identify as being particularly valuable. One is consistency. Can you talk about the need for consistency in communication during a crisis?
Well, I think it's fundamental. Everybody needs to be singing from the same hymn sheet. Each of the people that are represented, the various authorities, they need to be consistent in their message. To some extent, I think that occurred. I think there was also some inconsistent messages delivered which caused confusion and created potential anxieties. But the reason consistency is so important is that people in a crisis may not hear the message initially, they may interpret it differently. You have vulnerable groups who need communications to be simple. So the need to be consistent is critical because not everybody hears the same thing at the same time.
You also identify the need for empathy and understanding during crisis communication, during the response phase of a crisis.
Yes.
Could you enlarge on that, please?
Well, empathy and understanding. People in a crisis need to feel validated. They need to feel that their anxieties are being listened to, being heard. And so empathy and understanding is a critical tool in validating people's emotional state in a crisis. That is to say, we hear you, we understand where you're coming from, and therefore we know how to help you in the best possible way. So it's not an admission of guilt or liability, it's really saying we understand you, we empathise with you, and in so doing, it builds trust. And I'd argue that trust is the cornerstone of crisis communications.
And that's probably a good point to discuss the distinction between information and communication during a crisis. Professor McNamara?
I think that's one of the fundamental issues here. As I read the material, and particularly the more recent material sent to me, I would accept the point that there was even more information than what I realised distributed. So I don't contest that point. There was a lot of information. But information is not communication, and it's a common misunderstanding. Communication, in simple terms, is about the information that arrives and is understood in the mind of the audience. It's about interpretation and their meaning-making. And very often in management, I see this across all sectors, we use an outdated view of communication. We even say we communicated when we mean we sent information. And I think throughout this there was a lot of information, but at the end of the day, the community had fears that were not addressed and had concerns that were not addressed, so this information had not turned into meaning and interpretation within the community. And then we can analyse, well, why might have that been? So I don't contest the information. I think there was a lot of information. I have grave misgivings about the communication based on what I've seen.
Mr. Drummond, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I agree.
So information is a necessary part of communication, but it's not all of the picture.
It's about half.
Yeah, and what also matters is the receipt of that information by its intended recipient.
The interpretation of it, misunderstanding of it, reaffirming it, and a lot of that is human interpretation. It's a difficult part of it, but in very simple terms, it's not what you send out, it's what arrives.
Can I ask you, is there a two-way dimension here? Is it also about responding to people's needs and actually understanding what people are concerned about?
It's a very good point. Communication is two-way. In fact, when we teach communication to students, we say if it's one way, it's not communication, it's information transmission. It's clearly two-way, and the point that you bring out very well is that the two-way doesn't mean it always travels in one direction. Communication is sometimes top-down and sometimes community-up. And I think that we didn't see a lot of it. The information might have been coming up from the community, but it wasn't being received properly till much later. And so when I've made some comments about delays in communication, I'm particularly looking at information coming up from the community and not being, I'm reading statements saying they were identifying community leaders on the 21st of February. Well, that's quite a waste, 2 weeks after the fire started. You should have known, Lachlan said it before, you should have known those community leaders before the fire started, probably.
And if I can add to that, in this particular case, the opportunity for two-way communications was, I think, severely limited, so that the community had anxieties and concerns, but the ability for them to voice those and communicate those concerns to the relevant authorities was minimal.
raise the question of the way in which the communication, as distinct from the information, can potentially be done with, I'll raise the word, enthusiasm and energy, whether they are important factors, because it's clear that some of the information, without mentioning names, was communicated by one public performer with great enthusiasm and energy, and other information was conveyed without that same enthusiasm and energy. Is that just an ingredient of what you're saying, or would you like to elaborate further?
Yes, I absolutely agree. Tone and style are critical elements of communication, to the extent that a person can identify with the sender of the message, can see them as somebody that they can relate to. The likelihood is that the information is more likely to be received and trusted and acted upon. To the extent that they see a person or an organisation giving a message that might appear to be stiff or wooden, or coming from a group or a person that they can't identify with, there's a greater likelihood that the message will be rejected.
Yeah, I'll just very briefly add, you're absolutely right. I mean, the whole body of rhetorical theory about speakers says ethos, logos and pathos. They need credibility, they need facts and information, and they need emotional connection or empathy. And that is required, otherwise communication tends to not occur.
Can you teach the second part? Can you teach empathy and not to be wooden and stiff?
I've been trying to, but I fail often. I think you can teach skills and you can shift people's perspectives. I've worked with a lot of senior management who are so technically brilliant at their work but just forget about that human element. And so you can draw their attention to it, but ultimately personality, of course, does play a role. Traits in psychology will play a role, but certainly being aware of skills and just giving consideration to the other and thinking how they might feel and building your communication backwards. As Professor Capford alluded to before, letting the other speak and then addressing what the other says and what the other's concerned about, rather than distributing the information you think is relevant.
So that would be a common element in crisis communication training, that ability to recognise whether or not you're being received empathetically?
Very much so. One of my recommendations was training, and I wasn't for a moment suggesting there's not a lot of training and good technical skills, but I was particularly talking about addressing the human aspects of communication and meaning making and interpretation and empathising with people.
And if I can add to that, that would include identifying potential spokespeople in the event of a crisis that we believe, or that the authorities believe, is most likely to resonate with the audience.
So in appointing people to those roles, that would be a very critical element of that skill set.
Yes. Or you have senior technical staff who are doing their role and you accompany them with others who are community engagement people who do a lot of that with them. So often it's a team approach. I've worked with some computer engineers who didn't have a lot of human skills, and you pair them off with someone else who can handle that part of it.
With all due respect to engineers.
Yes. I love them dearly.
The third phase of emergency management and also crisis communication is the recovery phase. In what way do the requirements of crisis communication change once the crisis is in hand, the fire is out, the spill has been cleaned up? What's different about that phase compared to the response phase?
I'm not sure this fully answers the question. People want to move very quickly to that. I mean, people know there's a fire, know there's a problem. They have some immediate concerns about their health and their safety. As soon as that's addressed, though, they mainly want to know, what are you doing about it? What's going to happen next? And people actually are action-orientated. They want to know, what can I do? Not just to receive passive information, you're okay, just sit there and watch out the window. They want to know, what can I do? What should I do? And clear instructions. And so I think that you move very quickly towards you're almost moving to recovery stage while you're still addressing the operational crisis.
Yes, there can be an overlap between the two phases. Mr. Drummond, did you have anything to add to particular features of communication that are necessary, once the immediate crisis has passed?
I have nothing further above what Jim said.
Professor McNamara, we did ask you to, after identifying features of best practice at a theoretical level, provide us with a number of case studies, which you have done. I'd like to ask you about 3 only of those, ask you to talk about each of the case and identify particular features of it that have some similarity with the case that we're dealing with here. And the first of those in the case studies that you have listed was the James Hardie Industries and asbestos case study.
Yes, and I should preempt what I say by James Hardie was a particular case and where there was the High Court of Australia found some very serious problems within management. I'm not suggesting there are similarities at that level.
Yes,
what is interesting in the James Hardie one, though, was an inability to step up and be open about the problem. Asbestos had been a problem for a long, long time, and communities were slowly growing concerned about it. It was only when it burst out as a public issue that the company started to address it. So that's an issue. It needed to be much more proactive.
So you would identify a need for much greater level of preparedness.
Much greater preparedness and more openness, and the organisation then really tried to duck for cover as much as it possibly could, even to the extent, in James Hardie's case, we're trying to move the head office offshore. I don't want to get into the legal aspects of that. I'm not qualified for that, but the perception, the only perception that can give to people is this company just wants to hide. It may be not true, but it's the perception that comes across in the James Hardie case. But that was a particularly malevolent kind of crisis, and it has some similarities.
The second of the case studies I'd like you to elaborate on this morning is the BP Deep Horizon oil rig explosion and fire.
I put that case study in there because it's a fire. It had all of those dimensions of huge operational challenges. But for 2 reasons. There was a lot of comment by BP initially that they couldn't have foreseen this problem and it was unprecedented. They were deep sea drilling that had never been done before. And again, I'm not an engineer, but there was not even regulations in place at that time. Subsequently, they were introduced. So the argument was they should have realised that this is a highly dangerous activity and maybe done a lot more beforehand. And then the second point comes out of that is perceptions. I don't know that it was a wrong thing to do, but the CEO, BP, was A, slow to get there, to be on the scene. That caused negative perceptions, like we don't care. But secondly, he, during the course of, right in the peak of the crisis, and this is where lives were lost, he got on a plane and flew home to the UK to go back to a yacht race. Now, the message that sent was, I'm not saying it's as bad here, but just the invisibility of the CEO, the perception that it was obviously a family matter that he went home for, but the perception was very, very negative in the community, and people felt that the company demonstrated it simply didn't care. So it shows how sensitive public opinion is to not only what you say, but the visible actions, the symbolic gestures you make.
And then the third of the case studies I'd like to ask you to talk about this morning is the January 2011 Queensland floods, natural disaster in a regional area, at least for part of it, till the water reached Brisbane.
Lockyer Valley, definitely.
And also an instance of very effective use of social media during a crisis.
Yeah, that's a very, I think, informative case study for a whole lot of reasons. And I do commend the Victorian government departments in their adoption of social media. It doesn't address everybody. We must bear that in mind. And we talk about audience before. If you've got a low level or a lower level of an internet connection, you have to bear that in mind. But the departments here did use social media, and overall I think they did that well, and I'd commend them to keep doing that. But what was different in Queensland with the police is that it wasn't one-way traffic. It wasn't the department sending out information. The police, who generally are highly regulated, quite a bureaucratic department in my view, were actually engaged community and said, you tell us. And they solicited thousands and thousands of SMS messages, text messages, tweets on Twitter to gather information and respond to it. And so they were working in very much a partnership with the community. And that was the part that stood out. And people enjoyed it. People formed the opinion of the Queensland Police rose dramatically. And it was because of that they really engaged with the community. They really listening to us.
And there was, as I recall, some quite effective use of humour in some of their tweets.
Yes, and that occurred, would you believe, even in the Boston bombing that I've alluded to, where that's a terribly serious issue, but there was a even in great diversity, people value humour. It's something perverse about us. And that means having the protocols and all the procedures, they are important. We must have them. But at the end of the day, you're dealing with human beings. And I still think that was a little bit lost here in Morwell, is that we might have had all the protocols and all the procedures in the world, but acronyms this long, I've got a PhD and I can't learn the acronyms here, I'm sorry.
We've all been struggling.
They don't really help. At the end of the day, you're dealing with human beings. And what the Queensland Police did well was just be human. They sat, they talked, and they went out and they listened.
So you identify an interesting feature of use of social media in communications. It's more than a matter of simply posting information on a Facebook page or tweeting an update. There's more to the process, is there not?
Yes, I've written my book, The 21st Century Media Revolution, is about social media, and I go back to Professor Catford's statement that it's a two-way process, and a lot of organisations are making dreadful mistakes with social media. We've lived through the era of mass media, which is one-way transmission by and large. Social media is not a replacement to mass media, it's different, and the difference is that it's two-way, but too often we don't use it for that, and that's if anyone said what's the simplest difference, it's that social media is the people's media. So it's therefore for organisations a listening medium as well as a transmission medium.
So social media is a very effective way of getting information out into the community, but it's also a very effective way of reading what the community are saying and intervening in those discussions.
Nipping rumours in the bud, correcting misinformation, and again I sympathise with the organisations because there's often misinformation out there, but if you're active on social and you're responsive, you can go back in and say, yes, we hear you, but that's not quite right, bang. And again, the Boston bombing is a great example where the Boston Police Department were constantly tweeting and saying, no, that's not quite right, don't do that, watch this, don't take photos of the police. And it was a dialogue backwards and forwards between the citizens and the organisation.
Ms. Richards, sorry. Could I just ask, why is it important to aim for best practice, and what's the point of looking through these case studies?
Go for it. At the end of the day, I guess you're talking, there's a number of dimensions. I'd start with the broader one, and that is community welfare. At the end of the day, people want to live in a community and feel safe and feel that health is protected and that their government cares for them. So there's a trust in government. Dare I say, the latest trust research is showing trust in governments at an all-time low in Australia and the UK. At a corporate level, corporations usually want to have, and it does help them to have a relationship with their community. Companies can be terribly important to the economy, and governments will always look at their economic value, but at the end of the day, if the public is unhappy with that corporation, it does often result in regulation or tougher treatment from government. So corporations want to have community engagement and a good relationship. We want our communities to feel safe and trust our government. If we don't handle crises well, Lachlan said it before, trust, and it's on one of my charts, trust is a very, very key issue. I think it's what holds our community and our democracy together. Does that answer the question?
Did you have anything further to say, Mr. Drummond?
No, I agree with
that. I was discussing social media with Professor McNamara just a moment ago. But Mr. Drummond, in your report, you identified that in this event, traditional forms of media were particularly important and effective. Can you explain why that is?
Sure. So this community exhibits a range of differences that set it apart from, say, metropolitan Melbourne. Lower in terms of, typically anyway, lower in terms of income, lower in terms of education, poorer health outcomes, as we discussed, or as was discussed yesterday, and importantly, lower internet connectivity. So one of the critical...
And the internet connectivity in the Latrobe Valley is significantly lower than metropolitan Melbourne, is it not?
Yes, and I think I can even refer you to that.
60-something%.
Morwell, roughly speaking, I think Morwell's internet connectivity, I'm looking on Exhibit 2 on 6.5.4 of my report. And I'm having read Marita Tabane's statement, Morwell internet connectivity is around 67% as compared to, I think, 79% for Victoria generally.
So there's 12% of the population who you simply won't reach through the internet.
Yeah. So if I could just continue on that point. So what that means is that whilst it's a useful channel and it will become an increasingly important channel, I think for this community it's particularly important to have a diversity of communications, and I'd refer to more grassroots communications, door knocks, letterbox drops, use of the newspaper, local newspaper and so forth, as a way of maximising the reach of the message. I'd also make one other point about social media in this situation, which is that it's my opinion that what happened was that communications were problematic, and we'll come to this, I'm sure, perhaps inconsistent, problems with timeliness and so forth. And to the extent that the community lost trust with the communications, social media tended to fill that void. So what you then see is people on Facebook, Twitter and so forth within the community sending out their own messages, and people looking to social media to see what's actually going on. And the problem with that is that there is the opportunity or the possibility for misinformation. So where there was loss of control of messaging, social media filled that void to some extent, I think, in this case, and potentially problematically.
I fully endorse those comments that I very much commend social media, but in this particular case it could only be part of the communication solution.
Yes, and both of you comment on the fact that face-to-face communication was the most effective means of communication during the mine fire.
It usually is in life, actually, but in a crisis where emotions are heightened, people are under great pressure and tension, it's more important. We really need that human touch, and to know that people are present, visible, doing their job. We need to see it and we need to feel it. So yes, there's no substitute for face-to-face in a crisis.
Can I just pick up this point again, coming back to the two-way communication process, so that if you're in a face-to-face dialogue, there's an opportunity presumably to collect information and responses and feed that back up the system. Would you want to comment on that? And I suppose, perhaps not jumping the gun, but, to what extent was that loop being closed with the door knocks and the face-to-face communication?
I don't think it was enough. I'm not suggesting it wasn't done, but certainly going back to the point about there was a lot of information distribution. Communication by its nature is meant to be dialogic. We use the word without thinking of one way, but actually dialogic is essential. So I'd have to agree and say, when I was critiquing communication, I was seeing a lack of the two-way interactive process, a lack of listening, a lack of engaging with the community in a real true sense. And to some extent, the very fact that these public concerns are there and in the media and expressed is a sign that we have failed to some extent. It's not suggesting everything was a failure. But the reason we use those case studies is it's for all of us is about learning what we could do better and adapting it. And I would say a lot of things were done well. Clearly, a number of things were not done well, and dialogue and true communication, by and large, I believe, was not done well.
Just in terms of closing that loop, if I could add that my sense, and someone might be able to correct me on this, is that the door knock wasn't completed until well into March. 14th of March. Now, that's 5 weeks, roughly, from the start of the event. So you've got people who potentially haven't had that ability to close the loop until 5 weeks after the event or the crisis started. The second point I'd make about closing the loop is that I think the first of the community meetings didn't occur until the 14th, and I think there was one subsequently roughly a week later, 18th.
Yes, which may have been an example of the loop being closed. It was a meeting at which there was significant expression of anger, and it's described by Commissioner Lapsley in his statement as a turning point in the authorities' response to the fire.
Indeed, and I think you're absolutely right to pick up Craig Lapsley's statement there, and that it seemed that he recognised at that point that we needed to modify our approach in response to having listened to the community concerns. But my point is that the loop was closed, but it's 5 days, or it was beginning to be closed if I could, but it happened 5 days later, and I really don't think the opportunity or the channel existed adequately enough for community to feed back its concerns in a timely way.
If I can move now to your joint report and ask you to start with your assessment of communications by state, department and agencies. And Mr Drummond, can you identify the positive aspects of communication by the state?
Sure.
And in which I include the CFA, the police, the Department of Health,
Yep.
all of its agencies.
I think both Jim and I are in agreement in saying that relevant authorities and individuals were working hard under changeable and difficult circumstances, and they're to be commended for some of the communications. The communications that appeared to work best were those that were what we might call more traditional or grassroots communications, such as the face-to-face contact, door knocks organised by Latrobe City Council. ABC Radio was particularly important to communities. So in putting this report together, I looked at all of the community consultation videos and distilled all of that down and looked at what people in those consultations were saying was done well with respect to the communications. The community meetings were also a very good channel and opportunity, were regarded by the community as being good communications. The CFA was singled out by affected communities as performing particularly well, and I think that's indicative of the fact that the CFA in regional and rural communities is typically embedded in the community and therefore has a higher level of trust right from the start. Handouts and leaflets, another example of good communications. And then some specific individuals. So I note in looking at those community consultations that ambulance, a senior person from Ambulance Victoria was identified as being very good. And if I could quote from my report, I'm on page 8 at 6.2.6. The incident controller reports at the public meetings were really good. Early on they said, we don't know how long it will take. It was honest and felt trustworthy. So, in summary, examples of good communications in this crisis, particularly to this community, may not apply to all, were typically grassroots and through more traditional channels.
All right. Professor McNamara, was there anything you wanted to add to the identification of things that worked well in government communications?
No, I think we've said that. You said the ABC too, didn't you? I think, we saw a number of things that worked well.
Then moving to the issues that you've identified, in your joint report, the first of those issues is distribution and reach. Professor McNamara, could you enlarge on that issue?
That's the point that we have already talked about, is that while some of the handouts and leaflets were useful, there was a very heavy use of internet. A lot of the updates and smoke alerts, etc., were posted on the internet, and we've already talked about the lower internet connectivity in this area. Also, it's not just the actual connectivity. I'd make the point that what we call the digital divide, the reason that some people don't use the internet is cultural and educational and different groups and so on. So even though there's 67% connectivity, a lot of people in some groups aren't comfortable using the internet, and so the actual use is probably lower than that. So that was the point about distribution and reach. We didn't use enough of some of the things that Lachlan was just speaking about, and particularly some of the postings, updates coming from Department of Health, they seem to only be on the internet. And some of the more detailed information you had to log in and go. In fact, one place I went to all these sites and I had to do 4 clicks to get through to an actual piece of information. That's the first point, and then there are some others.
Yes. So the second issue identified is timing and tailoring. Mr Drummond, can I ask you to explain why that was an issue?
Absolutely. I'm going to talk here about timing and also timeliness. I'll make it perhaps a distinction between the two. But one of the things, as I sat down and analysed extremely carefully all of the community consultations, large amount of video material, one of the things that struck me and one of the things that came out most strongly and came out first was from concerns expressed by the community was the lateness of the communications. That is, communications appeared not to really ramp up until, say, week 2. And, that's problematic because you've got people who are physically experiencing smoke and ash and so forth and seeing dust settling in their house. They're in a heightened state of anxiety and they really have a need for communications. And many of the statements arising from those community consultations go to that. If I could look at 6.3.1 in my report,
which is on page 9.
It's on page 9, yes.
Over to, yes.
Now, I just want to make a couple of points here. These are the quotes you're seeing here are de-identified quotes from people who participated in the community consultations. And I'll just sort of pick a snapshot of some of the things people were saying. It took a week after the disaster before we heard anything substantive in an emergency response message from any of the government agencies. If I can go further down, it took too long for the government to acknowledge the health effects of short and long-term exposure. But I want to make...
If I can just stop you there, you do identify in your joint report under issues of timing and tailoring, the timing of the announcement of, you say evacuation, others would say temporary relocation of vulnerable groups on Friday the 28th.
So that brings me to my point
from a
about...
communications perspective, leave aside the health dimension, what's the issue with the timing?
That brings me to the point of timeliness. So my strong sense from having assessed the community response to this is that it seemed a bit arbitrary. That is, what had changed between Thursday the 27th or Tuesday the 26th and Friday the 28th. So the community was strongly of the opinion that it seemed arbitrary, and it occurred late in the afternoon on Friday the 28th. And some community members expressed that this was unfortunate in terms of being able to enact particular plans or get organised or communicate with others. So late in the afternoon on a Friday, I wouldn't regard as being particularly appropriate in terms of timeliness, particularly given that the community believed or interpreted this as being somewhat arbitrary and that there was apparently no material change in events 1, 2, 3 days before.
Professor McNamara, did you want to add anything to that issue of timing and tailoring that you've both identified?
No, I think only to say that timing, that was one particular instance, but if you look at, I looked at the date of the first of a number of things, the first letterbox drop, door knocking, not only did it not finish, and I do realise that council in particular had limited resources, but it didn't begin until the 25th of February. That's quite some considerable time, and the meetings, so each of the key communication things, as much as they were important, A, they were information more than communication, and secondly, they were happening a bit too late.
And finally, if I could add on that it appeared that there was no specific communications plan and strategy for the affected communities, and that in fact needed to be written. So
it wasn't available till the 24th of February. So I do find it very surprising that there wasn't a communication strategy. They were actually writing it, and it was distributed on the 24th of February. So that seems, given that this mine's been here a long time, to me it would be reasonable to think there could be a problem. Why wouldn't we have a community engagement and communication strategy in place years ago?
And writing it on the run doesn't strike me as best practice.
You next identify a poor fit with community profile. And Mr Drummond, this is your particular issue. Is there anything you want to add to what you've already said about the particular profile of the Morwell and Latrobe Valley community and the communications during the fire?
Yeah, I think we've pretty much covered it, but my sense is that this is a community that is different in a number of ways and needs communications tailored to that. So, the Morwell community has characteristics. It typically has smaller households, lower level of education, blue-collar employment. Now this, I want to hasten to add that this doesn't affect how you should... it's more about the reach and distribution and taking this into account. It doesn't mean that you speak to these people any differently. You speak to them plain, simple language.
Yeah, it means technical language doesn't work, for example. You need to translate. We all have troubles with technical language.
And speak in an honest and plain manner as you would to any community.
Yes. The next issue identified is disconnect, and Mr. Drummond, you've introduced a concept of cognitive dissonance that I think comes from psychological literature. And you've illustrated the point that you make by a diagram that appears on page 30 of your report. Could we have that on the screen, please? Now, what do you mean by cognitive dissonance in a communications context?
Well, if I could start at the top of that diagram and work through it, and then I'll give you a definition of cognitive dissonance. But really, another way of thinking about this, as we've said in this joint report, is what we saw as a disconnect. So, as we've discussed from the start of this, communications aren't necessarily, or certainly not always verbal. So if you look on the left there, what the community was seeing was some actions from authorities. So if we just quickly walk through those. Firstly, the community's seeing that firefighters are being treated for carbon monoxide exposure. I think that sends an alarming message to the community. They are also seeing that the CFA pulls crews out due to toxic gas. And then on the 15th of February, you've got a hazardous materials declaration and firefighters being reduced to 2-hour shifts. And then you also have a watch and act alert with respect to carbon monoxide.
So this was on the 15th of February, the Saturday afternoon?
Yes, that's correct, yeah. Now, putting all that together, I think it's absolutely reasonable that the community would interpret that as being, we've got a serious incident, issue, crisis on our doorstep, and this is generating anxiety, fear and concern, because these are the actions I'm seeing, these are the physical communication, if you will, from what the various authorities are doing. In addition, the residents themselves are experiencing adverse health effects, coughing, wheezing, blood noses and so forth, the ash and dust fallout in their properties, and they have many questions for which they're either not getting answers or receiving inadequate answers. If you put those two things together, what you get is a message takeout, that is that one of anxiety, fear, concern, and there's a serious issue. On the other hand, and to the box on the right, what we see in terms of communications, and particularly from, I think, the Chief Health Officer, that is that there's no need to evacuate, we're seeking further advice, vulnerable groups take care, enact your asthma management plans and so forth. And what I also regard as being somewhat repetitive, self-evident and uninformative statements, and I'm referring there to the smoke advisories, numerous smoke advisories. Now, the people of Morwell, as they told me loud and clear as I looked at these community consultations, was they only had to go outside to see what the smoke was like. So what we have on the one hand is anxiety, fear and concern and a genuine belief that they're dealing with a serious issue, and that doesn't match with the message being sent out by the relevant authorities. That is, take minor precautions, just enact your asthma management plan. And what that leads to is something that we call cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is a well-established psychological theory put forward by Festinger in 1957. And really, what it, summarising it, it's the feeling a person experiences when they hold two conflicting viewpoints and attempt to reconcile those viewpoints. Finally, I would say that in the reconciliation of those viewpoints, you can go one of two ways. And in the case of the affected communities in this region, you can either reject what authorities are saying, that is, you don't believe it, it doesn't accord with what you're experiencing, or it can lead to self-doubt. And my major concern is that when you're dealing with a lower socioeconomic status community, a vulnerable community, a community with poorer health outcomes, lower levels of education and so forth, it's more likely to lead to self-doubt, to people questioning, saying, well, hang on, I'm feeling one way and yet authorities who I place trust in and who I'm relying on to help me are telling me something completely different. And so if I could just finish this point with a quote from Lisa Wilson's witness statement on page 29 of my report, just immediately above that diagram. I think this summarises cognitive dissonance very well. And if I can quote, Lisa says, "I'm well educated and have travelled, yet my experiences during this period made me feel stupid and disheartened."
All right, so there's a possible example of communications that contributed to this cognitive dissonance that you've identified both on the 28th of February. There was a high-level smoke advisory issued by the EPA that afternoon, and this is a kind of communication that you've identified as repetitive and perhaps not suitable to the crisis as it had developed by this time.
Repetitive communications at one level are important. But what happens is if you're issuing 100 plus smoke advisories, EPA smoke advisories, one of the issues with that is that people tend to tune out. And if you have people tuning out from your messaging in a crisis, I think that's a major problem. So it's not about quantity, but rather about quality. And what we tended to see with the smoke advisories was that it tended to say the same thing on an ongoing basis and didn't really add much to the conversation or the communications that was going on.
Now, I'm not sure if both of you can see the two documents that have come up on the screen. Are we able to give them up? There are two communications that were issued, one by the Chief Health Officer and one by the Environment Protection Authority, both on the afternoon of the 28th of February. And we'll just arrange for hard copies to be provided to you. I'm sorry, I should have organised for this to happen earlier. But we have an EPA high-level smoke advisory that, as you've identified, have been issued a number of times. It's in a standard format. It quotes the Chief Health Officer as advising that excessive smoke can aggravate existing conditions, that people should avoid prolonged and heavy physical activity, and that people should take their medication, consult their doctor. At the same time, the Chief Health Officer issued a community update, and along with this went a news release that advised people in vulnerable groups to consider temporarily relocating from Morwell. And that's a message direct from the Chief Health Officer, who's also quoted in the EPA media release. So we'll just arrange for you to have both of those documents in front of you.
Yeah, depending on the question.
Sorry, I'm making quite unreasonable demands of my instructors here. There we are.
Yeah, I think I'm across these and have seen them before.
Yes. So is that an example of the disconnect that you've identified as an issue?
Well, just taking the temporary relocation, firstly, my sense on that is that it came late, on the 28th.
Yes.
And to your point about a disconnect, you've got people who've been living with this issue from the 9th until the 28th, feeling serious, adverse health effects and consequences. But it's only on the 28th, and as I said earlier, on a somewhat apparently arbitrary basis, that they're asked to relocate, or vulnerable people are asked to relocate. So I think that's an example of that. It's probably an example of acknowledgement of the seriousness of the event. So, at one level this might go to reconciling that cognitive dissonance, but I think the way it was handled probably wasn't ideal. And to the EPA smoke advisories, of which there were many, I think they're important, but I don't believe that issuing as many as they did, saying things like people with asthma should follow their asthma management plan. I think to some extent, say it once or twice, but it's self-evident, and the community had more fundamental questions like, how do I manage animals and livestock? And granted, some of these questions were answered, but is tank water safe to drink? How to remove ash from pools? These are questions that were there virtually from day one, but instead we're seeing things like, be aware that there's smoke in the area.
Professor McNamara, did you have any comment you wanted to make on these two almost simultaneous communications?
No, I think it's been mostly covered, and also the context is important. There were high smoke alerts issued long before that, so why suddenly we've had high smoke, extreme high smoke even before this, and then suddenly with one high smoke alert we've got a temporary relocation, and it seemed late, and then on a Friday afternoon, there was just people I talked to, there was a sort of feeling that this was fulfilling a legal or bureaucratic requirement to get something out rather than actually talking to people.
Can I just ask, wouldn't you expect, though, each would refer to the other, or you'd have a combined release?
Yes, there is evidence that there was a lot of cooperation and collaboration, but any crisis I've ever been associated with is you've got to get people in the one room and you've got to lock them away often, and there's got to be very intensive cooperation. So there is some sign that there wasn't enough because there was inconsistency. And I mean, bearing in mind at the same period of this, the mine had issued statements and put out a full-page ad, and the second paragraph, as I recall, actually used the words, this is the most serious event has ever confronted the mine. So people are reading that and going, holy hell, the mine's saying this is the most serious thing ever happened. We've been told to watch and wait in our homes. What's going on? I mean, if I saw that statement from the mine, I'd be heading out of town real quick.
And Professor Catford, I agree with your point. Looking at the timing of this 17:45 on Friday the 28th, the EPA media release has gone out after the temporary relocation advice. Therefore, you would think it would be making some reference to it from the point that we've made all the way along with this submission in terms of distribution and reach. Everybody needs to be saying the same thing, so that if you only receive the smoke advisory, it points to the temporary relocation advice. And which it didn't.
Now, if I can move to the second of the questions that we asked you to address in your joint report, which was whether you consider that GDF Sewers had engaged in appropriate communication strategies during the fire. Professor McNamara, could you talk about the opinion that you've expressed there, which is a stark no?
Yes, not everyone may agree with it, but the things I looked at was the fundamental principle in crisis all over the world is the senior management's got to be visible to the community and showing concern. And I read the explanation of why the company didn't attend some of the public meetings. I read that. It's not a sufficient reason. I mean, any time the CEO was not present in any crisis around the world, there's been criticism of it. Even if it was standing there and saying, we visibly support the authorities, we're working with the authorities. So the visibility of the company sends a message that they might have been caring, but the message is they didn't. The full-page advertisements that came eventually, as I said, the second paragraph to me was quite alarming, and at the same time the government authorities were saying it's all okay. That was concerning. Criticism I've levelled at many of the authorities, in fact all of them in the company, is that apart from very occasional statements such as we understand the inconvenience, I think that was in one of the statements, there was no real deep expression of serious concern for the community, no expressions of empathy, and again that's a fundamental principle. If something's gone wrong, you do not take legal responsibility necessarily, but you say, we are concerned, we're sorry about this, you express that. And so I didn't see that as well. And then the revived Morwell initiative, I accept that's a debatable whether that's good practice or not, but to me, it came too late. It addressed a relatively small financial amount to individuals, albeit I do accept that $670,000 into the community would be, in business sense, would be quite significant. But it's money, and again, if people are no longer trusting and people are angry, I tend to find money doesn't get you out of trouble. Money can even backfire. So I think, again, there was focusing on operational things and offering people a bit of money belatedly, when actually what they wanted was a lot more demonstration of care and communication and engagement and listening weeks and weeks before. So that was the basis of my concern. Again, it's not about information, it's not about their operational performance. That may have been excellent. It's about the communication.
Mr. Drummond, was there anything you'd like to add to that?
In terms of the money GDF Sewers gave to the local community members?
In terms of the overall assessment that its communication strategy was not appropriate?
Yeah, I agree with that. I'll make just one point to follow up on Jim's. I think the timing of the giving of the money to the community is interesting, occurring I think only last week or the week before, as opposed to perhaps when they needed it right in the middle of the crisis. I'd make one other point that I noted strongly in the community consultations, that the way in which the state government gave money to affected communities via the healthcare card scheme, I think, created some division in that some people got the money and some people didn't. And I think that was problematic. My concern with the way in which GDF Sewers has approached this is that in giving money again, there will always be some who receive it and some who miss out. And I think that has the potential, at least, to exacerbate divisions in the community. And that's perhaps my final point on GDF Sewers might be to say, or just to quote from my report on the bottom of page 19 at 6.4.5, and this is a community member saying this: lack of representation from Hazelwood Mine at the first two community meetings, when they said they thought it was all to do with health and therefore didn't deem it necessary to attend.
And that itself is
consistent
communication.
with what you've identified. Yes.
Sends a message.
All right, if we can move now to the recommendations that you make in your joint report for improvements, should, in the event of similar crises in future. Professor McNamara, if we could start with your recommendations. The first of those is a review by GDF Sewers of its crisis management and crisis communication strategy. Is there anything you want to add to what you've already said as to why that's recommended?
Well, I feel that's a very reasonable thing to do. In fact, I would argue that after any incident, you should have a review and see what you did well and what you didn't do well. I've never met an organisation that can't improve. So I'm suggesting a review and to take on board things that might come out of this inquiry and out of the reports. It's not telling them what to do. I don't have enough specific knowledge, but a review seems very eminently sensible.
The next one relates to government and the need for speedier communication.
Yes, and I think we've both noted that all along. There just was 5, 7, 9, 10, 15 days delay in a lot of the postings of information online, the door knocking, and a range of those things. And it is difficult, I understand that, but you've just got to get into the community more quickly. And if we keep hearing that they didn't realise it was a community problem, well, that's a planning issue, because I don't know how you have a coal mine like within hundreds of metres of a town, a brown coal mine, and not anticipate that there might be a problem at some stage.
And then you talk about the need for crisis communication training.
Yes, and that relates probably, I haven't had the opportunity to read the actual plans that they have, and they may be comprehensive, but what was evident in this instance was the lack of the human element, the lack of, this demographic data that Lachlan talked about, that's been available. ABS, Bureau of Stats has that data. We know all this data, and yet they were gathering that data post the fire. So clearly there needs to be a speeding up in a number of things, I would think. And I have read a statement, and I think it's in Mr. Bain's statement, that it talks about the risk of the risk to energy supply diminished and community effects came to light. And this is around about the 16th or 20th of February this is occurring. Now, community effects came to light. One would have thought you'd know there'd be community effects from day one. And so it's symbolic of what I think is in a lot of the documents, that it was a bushfire, then it became an industrial problem, and then it was an afterthought, oh my goodness, there's a community problem. And planning would have endeavoured to address all of those together.
Professor McNamara, I think to be fair, your recommendation talks about the relevant government authorities, and I think we've heard your evidence that there were authorities, in particular representatives of those authorities, that actually communicated quite well, and so I think there's various levels of crisis communication training that are required by different government authorities rather than just putting them all in one bucket. Would you like to elaborate without being too particular?
I completely take that point, and I'm worried about who might meet me outside afterwards. But I think we've both made it clear that the fireys are visible and on the ground, and the CFA, and of course the CFA does have a lead role during a fire, and it is hard to detect how much support has been given by EPA and health behind that we couldn't see, and I accept that was happening. But certainly some of the statements and the online postings from the Department of Health and some of those were areas that we did criticise as being, I didn't even I don't think I could find a word of just empathy and caring expressed. It was very much like someone was reading a protocol and following the manual.
And then the last two recommendations that you highlight both relate to community relations. Can you explain those, please?
Yeah, I could be wrong or miss something on this, because I read later in some of the data that there were community engagement people involved, but I didn't hear that in any of the statements that I read. So one of my recommendations was, given that senior management and health officers and others are busy at the higher level, and given the council lacked resources and that appeared to, and the door knock didn't start till the 25th of February, there clearly and what I've seen happen elsewhere is that there are specialist community relations people, and they are trained psychologists usually. They're people who deal with people, getting into the community straight away and acting as an interpreter between the technical information and the departments doing their job and actual on the street. And I recommended that because I couldn't see enough of it. And then the final part was working at grassroots. I believe that Voices of the Valley started during the crisis. We often overlook these groups, and again, it's just a matter for the councils and others to think about, but embracing those groups rather than simply leaving them out there as the opposition in a way. Those are ready-made voices of the community. Bring them in, listen to them, and ask them, how can we help? What can we do together? So more partnering with some of those groups, I think, would have helped.
Yes.
And if we didn't do it then, do it now for the next time.
And that segues neatly into the recommendations that you've made, Mr. Drummond, particularly the second one, facilitating two-way communication through the establishment of a community advocate group. What do you have in mind there?
The underlying recommendation here is that we need to give residents a voice. Residents need to have the ear of those in authority who are making decisions that affect their lives. And both Jim and I agree that, as we've talked about, we didn't feel that loop was adequately closed. So my recommendation here is that what we really need is to establish, or in faced with a similar crisis, establish a community advocate group that, for example, might have a single spokesperson, but it might have a body of 4, 5, 6 community leaders who give input to that single spokesperson. And I would suggest that single spokesperson should be standing alongside people like the Chief Health Officer or the Incident Controller, so that it gives the very strong impression that the community has representation at the highest levels of decision making.
Is that not a role that you see being filled by local government?
It could be, and I think local government could inform that advocacy, but as my report points out, local government or communities like Morwell are typically distrustful of government, and therefore I would suggest that it's probably better to have local government to some extent at arm's length, involved perhaps in assisting, but not necessarily a part of that advocacy group.
And then And the next...
Can I just interrupt to, in your recommendations, Mr Drummond, you referred not to the joint ones, but in the recommendation 3, I think on page 36, refers to an organisation like the CFA is trusted and respected, therefore a spokesperson of the organisation or even someone from a military background is likely to be better received. There's reference in the affidavit we've got that we're hearing from the witness later in the day, which does talk about the specific or the development within the CFA of a community engagement program, which includes training for appropriate spokespersons. I take it that you, having a knowledge of the CFA, would consider that something that ought to be developed, because it potentially has the independence of government. If you've got the right local organisation, you won't be aware of whether they've got, or it does seem from feedback that's come, that Morwell has the right kind of organisation here, but the limitation would also be, as I think you'd be aware, that in some parts of Victoria the CFA is not as good at community engagement as it appears to be in Morwell.
Yeah, my sense is that the CFA in this community, and in most, is very well regarded, trusted, embedded, and therefore the CFA would be a potential candidate for engagement and liaison with the local community so as to close that loop.
Ms Richards, sorry, Chairman. Some of the evidence we've heard over the last 8 days has spoken about this local trusted networks, and we can apply that to any community, and that you have those networks prepared, and I think you've spoken about that this morning, identifying, I guess, for various representative parts of the community, so it could be CURI or the CALD, which I think stands for Communities with an Alternative Language, or, sorry, I don't know the exact acronym.
Culturally and linguistically diverse.
Thank you. And so who is responsible for identifying those local networks, and how, I guess as a community, how do we identify them so that there is some preparation beforehand and those people are identified?
I think it's critical. There are community groups, CURI in this area, CALD groups among others. They've got to be, there almost needs to be an audit of particular groups and spokespeople identified within those groups. Now, to your question as to who should facilitate that, yeah, my sense is that council would have the knowledge of and the access to those groups, and would probably be ideally positioned to manage that process.
And it occurs to me that different agencies may start identifying trusted networks in their own area of activity independently of one another. So, for example, the Department of Health may identify the local GPs and have well-established channels of communication
well, local
with those.
GPs is a good example. That my understanding from what I've read is that none of the local doctors were briefed or given information, and they would seem to be an absolute key part that people would go to for advice. Now, I could be wrong, but that's what I can't find any evidence that local GPs were brought into the loop. They seem an obvious group.
Now, just two more of your recommendations, yes, Mr Drummond, before I sit down and give someone else a turn. The third dot point under your recommendations is ensure that communication is simple, meaningful, uses plain language and avoids jargon and acronyms. There's a real art to doing that, is there not? It's not a simple thing.
Oh, of course. But refer, PM 2.5, PM 10, foreign particulates. There are a whole, I don't have the language immediately to hand, but there were a whole lot of references. And I acknowledge that it is a difficult situation because you are dealing with complex matters, and in this case, quite technical. But that doesn't preclude or mean that it's not absolutely fundamental to, in any community, not just in affected communities around Morwell, as both Jim and I have been saying, be direct, honest, use simple language and use the language of the people of the community to whom you're speaking.
And then the last of the recommendations you've made that I'd like to highlight is the importance of using multiple channels. So it's necessary to concentrate both on traditional methods, face-to-face contact, as well as social media and use of the internet.
Yeah, and the point I'd add to this, or that appears there, is that it's critical that this happens early in the crisis. And whilst we had things like door knocks and leaflets and so forth, they tended to occur later in the crisis, and by that stage you've got a community with heightened levels of anxiety, and the sooner you can deal with this and get that reach and distribution, the better.
Thank you. I've no further questions for either of you at this time. Mr Reardon has told me he has some questions, particularly for Professor McNamara. Mr Reardon is Senior Counsel for GDF Sewers. I'll ask you some questions.
Yes, thank you. An inquiry, please. As was indicated by Council Assisting, I appear on behalf of Hazelwood Mine, and so my questions will tend to be directed to the matters that you found or the opinions you expressed with respect to the mine response. Might I start by saying that the ultimate response from, I think you, Professor, that there should be a review is a given. Plainly enough, following these events and the inquiry, the mine will be undertaking a review as you suggest. But I did want to ask you some questions about the assumptions and premises that you relied upon in coming to your conclusions for the purposes of better understanding some of your comments and recommendations. In your report, you attached the letter you received from the Principal Legal Advisor for the inquiry at Appendix 1. I take it you have that in front of you, Professor?
Yes.
Yes, and it's now on the screen. Essentially, the letter requests that you identify or respond to 5 particular topics or questions, and you were provided with access to media monitoring in relation to the fire, and the inquiries requested a number of statements, including from the Fire Services Commissioner and other people's outline, and saying they'll provide them to you when they become available. Did you have a list of the information which you had available at the time of your preparation of your first report?
Do I have a list of it?
Yes.
I received a lot of documentation sent to me. I also went on personally to every one of the websites. I searched cached memory of websites, of statements. I used a number of online searches. I would certainly concede there could have been print-only documents that I may not have seen, but certainly if it was online, I did a lot of my own searching and own research, and I used a research assistant to assist me in endeavouring to get copies of all of the relevant documents. In some cases with GDF, I noticed that they had posted an online statement and then actually replaced it with a new version of the statement. I did manage to retrieve some of the earlier documents, but I think I accessed most of what I...
My question at this stage was a more limited one. I was wondering whether you actually had a list of the information that you had available to you upon which you based the opinions in your first report. And I take it the answer to that question is you did not.
I don't
and
have a single
and you've
list.
attempted to describe what you did do. Is that correct?
I don't have a single list of the topic or the title of documents, but I looked at approaching 1,000 documents in the course of this.
And I take it that since your first report, you've been provided now with some additional documents, which I think Council Assisting identified.
That is true.
Is that the extent of the additional documents that you've had reference to since your first report? Those which have been identified by Council Assisting?
Yes.
Okay. Now, if we go to your report and page 42 of it, I take it that what you set out there was, in effect, the communication efforts which were undertaken by GEF as you understood them at the time of the preparation of the first report.
Yes.
And at that time you were aware of 4 media releases, the first of which occurred on the 11th of March, a month after the fire, correct?
That's true.
The second matter about which you were aware was that on the 22nd of May there were the $100 gift vouchers that they'd undertaken after the event, and you were also able to pick up on the website one letter from George Graham that you referred to as well. Was that correct?
I picked up a number of updates on the website. That was one in particular that was one of the more extensive ones. I was aware of press advertisements and other matters as well.
At that time?
Yes, just in the final days of as we were revising the report, what I did find is the full-page press advertisements appeared to be the same copy that was in some of the update leaflets that I had already looked at.
Yes, okay. Well, if that's right, why wouldn't you refer to them when in the paragraph you say that in this case little can be said about the mine operator in terms of public communication during the crisis, as there was relatively little specifically, and then you set out and you don't mention the advertisements?
The advertisements, I think it was in the final days of writing the report. Perhaps I could have done, but the point I still come back to is what I said earlier, is that I was looking at communication, not necessarily information. And when I discovered that the press advertisements were in fact a placement of an information sheet that I'd already looked at, I was focusing particularly on what communities were understanding from it. But I think the actual copies in the newspaper I didn't see till either the day I was submitting or the day after, and I didn't specifically refer to press advertisements. I don't know that they tangibly change anything. They're the distribution of the same information I'd seen before.
Well, again, I don't want to dwell too long on this, but I do want to understand what you knew about what the Hazelwood mine was doing and saying. But on page 43, you make reference to a posting on the website of George Graham on the 20th of February, which, as you say, is in substance the same as the first full-page ad that was placed on the same day. But you don't refer to the follow-up advertisements. And again, I was wondering whether that was because they hadn't been brought to your attention or for some other reason.
To answer the question as usefully as I can, there was some additional information that I was not aware of at the time of writing the report. So I'll accept there was more information issued by the mine company than I was aware of. Was there more communication by the mine company is the point that I would debate.
Well, and this point about whether or not when a mine company, when anybody sits at a full page, whether that's communication or information, this is the distinction you're drawing, is it?
Yes, and particularly if that full-page ad is the same information that's already been distributed on the web and then in updates.
All right. Well, maybe I'll come to that in a moment, and give you an opportunity to comment on that as a means of communication. But the other matter that you appear to have done is assumed that the mine had not fulfilled the preparation best practices that you referred to in pages 9 and 10 of your report. Is that correct?
I was not assuming anything, but I was looking for evidence of it, and I didn't find evidence of it because the mine company, for example, I was critical of not attending the public meetings because visibility and symbolic attendance and being present is a key principle in crisis communication. So my evidence was they were not following.
We come to that in a moment, and I understand that you wish to make that point, and I want to ask you about it, give you a chance to develop it. And my question probably wasn't as clear as it should be, because you point out that in the first 4 points, scenario development, preparation, monitoring, network, bridge building, prior to the crisis occurring, correct?
Yes.
Did you assume or infer that in fact Hazelwood Mine had not addressed substantially all of those 4 questions?
I don't think I've said that anywhere, have I?
Well, I think you do make comments about their preparation, but we might come to them. I'm just wondering whether or not you do say that you've drawn that inference or not.
I think I was mainly talked about visibility, but if I've talked about...
I'll take you to where you comment on preparation later, but the point is that you weren't given access to, were you, to the Hazelwood Emergency Response Plan, the Mine Fire Policy and Code of Practice. I can go through these singly if you prefer. The Hazelwood Mine Fire Instructions, or the specific Mine Fire Preparedness and Mitigation Plan, which was in place immediately prior to this fire. None of those things were given to you.
That's true.
And that's where you would normally find preparedness, relevant persons who take control in the case of emergency and the like, and this inquiry has heard quite a bit of evidence about those features. So you're not in a position to comment on whether or not the Hazelwood Mine had substantially achieved those first 4 points of pre-crisis preparedness.
No, but you'd have to tell me where I commented on it not being prepared for those. I don't recall that I said they were not prepared in those 4 areas.
For these purposes, without going to that, you're not saying now in your evidence that they were not prepared in those 4 areas?
I think there was some lack of preparation, yes, because we're talking about the point I just made about being visible, attending public meetings, expressing concern. There's a number of principles of crisis communication. Now, bear in mind, I'm talking about preparedness in communication too. I don't dare comment on their operational preparedness.
The first 4 points, of course, do talk about operational, that you identify in your report, do go beyond communication preparedness, though, don't they?
They are crisis preparation, communication preparation steps.
Yeah, well, I'll suggest to you, without going to you, the fact is that I'd suggest to you that it goes beyond that in identifying potential risks and the like, would be part of an overall emergency action plan, wouldn't it? Not just a communication plan.
As I said earlier, yes, to some extent that's true. They have to dovetail together because the identification of risks and things that will happen link from overall operational plans. But all of those points that I outlined on page 9 and 10 are specifically to do with crisis communication. The scenario development is development of the scenarios in relation to the community, in relation to communication. How will it play out in the media, not just how do we put the fire out?
Yes. And that would normally be included in the part of the structure. In an emergency structure, you'll have people who'll be handling the media, and plainly enough, you'll have people who'll be handling, in this case, the fire, but whatever the crisis might be, correct?
That's true.
Now, could I ask you to, whether or not you either assumed or became aware that in this state there was this one source, one message is the way it's referred to, approach to communication, or no, broader than that, I'm sorry, I'll withdraw that, but there is meant to be a coordinated approach to crisis management, and you're aware of that?
Yes.
And you're aware of the fact that that includes one source, one message, and therefore ensuring that there was one message going out, in this case from the incident controller, who'd taken control of the fire on the Sunday night, the 9th. Are you aware of that principle?
Yes.
And are you aware that under that principle, the incident controller takes control not only of the fire but also the communication with the public with respect to the fire?
I have been critical of the government agencies as well, I point out, and the concept of coordination totally support that. The concept of one message, I mean, that's nonsense. There's multiple messages. There's health messages, there's safety messages, evacuation. There's multiple messages. Coordination and being consistent which we both support, does not necessarily mean that the mine can't be present and visible and standing united. And that's what I was talking about.
And we'll come to that. But
that's part of coordination.
But certainly you understood that there was a principle that the communication with respect to the fire should be directed through the incident control.
I read that, and I've also read the statement from the mine where they offered the explanation of why they didn't attend. And I think I've answered the question. I understand that.
You understand it, yes.
That doesn't mean to say they can't attend a public meeting and stand there and support.
And we'll come to that. I just want to make sure that you understand that was a principle, and you also understand that's a principle that affected them, that they considered that they should, in fact, subordinate themselves to the message as was put out by the incident controller through the CFA, etc. Did you understand that? That was their view.
I can accept that's their perception.
And can I also put it to you that we've heard from Commissioner Lapsley, who has agreed that he considered that to be the appropriate approach. Now, having said that, do you have a different view as to whether or not the mine in this crisis management should subordinate itself to the incident controller for the purposes of communications with the public?
I think we're talking around it a little bit, because the word subordinate, we can use that word. I would understand that the mine would not take a lead position and go out and start issuing statements. And I haven't suggested that. I've simply talked about, if there's a public meeting, I would advise every company to be visible, to be there and stand up alongside and support. That can still be subordinate. But when you're not there, as a communication person, the public's perception, I think, is they're not interested, they're too busy doing something else.
And I understand the criticism, and I'll come back to it. I just want to make sure that you understand some of the other factors that were taken into account, some of the other actions that were taken by the Hazelwood mine at the time. Now, were you aware that throughout this time, whilst they did subordinate themselves to the incident controller for the purposes of making public communication about the mine, at all times they had a media officer who responded in particular to any media requests throughout the course of the fire? Was that something that you were informed about?
I discovered that in some of the documents, yes.
You would have discovered that presumably in the statement that you got from Mr Harkins after the completion of your first report?
Yes, I have read that.
Okay. And you would agree that's a desirable thing for the mine to do, to make itself available to the media, to respond to questions as the media feels like they need some information?
Yes.
Yes. Can I suggest to you also that because of the community concern, they established a hotline so that the community could contact Hazelwood Mine and have a response to their questions, and they had a particular advisor who took responsibility to ensuring that people who wanted to contact the mine would get a response to any questions they had. Were you aware of that?
I think there was one I was not aware of until probably in the last few days.
Yeah, okay. But again, you would endorse that as being an appropriate approach and an application of your principle of listening to the community and responding to the particular concerns of the community, wouldn't you?
Yes, provided it is coordinated with the authorities.
Of course, yes. And it's critically important, isn't it? Because we've all had the experience with trying to find a telephone number to ring Telstra and we just can't talk to them. It's critically important that the community should feel that they have a number where they can contact the Hazelwood mine at a time like this to voice their concerns and get responses to their concerns. You'd agree with that, wouldn't you?
Yes, mostly. I mean, I think my criticisms are elsewhere. I think the hotlines that are most important are the official government hotlines that people would go to. So I think it's an okay thing to do, but I don't think the mine having a hotline would be something I would have criticised them if you didn't.
Okay.
There are a lot of hotlines available to the public to go to the authorities.
I understand your criticisms elsewhere. I was hoping to get some bonus points, Professor.
But I think if it can help you, I certainly am conceding that there was more done by the mine in information than I was aware of. I would put that on the record and say there was a lot more done than I understood, but I still come back to my critique of the communication and the engagement and issues like visibility and symbolic meanings.
I understand that, and we'll come to them. I want to also mention to you that you probably knew that there were multiple direct lines of communication from the management of the mine, with plainly enough with incident controller, but also with community leaders and council, etc. These persons had strong lines of communication with the mine. You would have appreciated that was likely to have happened?
I certainly assumed that there would be very strong communication between the mine and all the various authorities, and the evidence I saw suggests that that was the case. I'm not aware of the mine having direct communication with community leaders during the crisis.
And again, that's all part of when the message is put out by some single source to avoid the sorts of inconsistencies that Mr. Drummond has highlighted as well. It's critically important that the mine be able to feed into that source, to the source, to enable it's able to have some influence on the content of the message that goes out, correct?
Yeah.
Now, were you aware of the internal communications that the mine was putting out to its, or in the first instance, to its some 800 employees who are plainly also residents and members of family in the area? You would have seen that from Mr. Harkin's second statement?
I read Mr. Harkin's statement, yes, and in fact, under communication, it did seem that a lot of what was described was what I'd call the internal communication, so I would agree that was possibly excellent. My brief was to look at public communication, of course.
Then again, as you identify, you would think that the mine would want to maintain good relations with employees as well, particularly as so many of this community are employees. That was something that they felt at liberty to do while still maintaining the one source, one message, and you would agree that was a very it was very good to have a strong line of communication with its employees, many of whom were worried about whether or not they were going to have a job in the following month. That's plainly something that the company should do.
It's plainly something the company should do. I'd only caution I'd add is I know the company says they did it. I look at evidence. I actually haven't seen any evidence that those 800 employees felt there was good communication. So neither of us have that information. Perhaps they didn't understand it either. I don't know.
Well, possibly.
Maybe they did.
Could the witness be shown Annexure 8? Did you have a look through these documents? They were exhibits to Mr. Harkin's statement. Did you see them?
I have read a number of them.
This is the Annexure 8 to Mr. Harkin's statement, I should say.
Is this survey data?
No, these are the...
I'm aware of all the things that were done. All I'm qualifying is when you say there was good communication, I didn't read something to show that the employees felt it was good communication and that they were happy.
Well, for that you'd need to do a survey of the employees, wouldn't you?
Yes, and I'm not suggesting you had to, but you were making the point to me that there was good communication internally.
You're the expert, Professor. You should be able to tell us whether it's good communication.
I think it was a good attempt.
That's as high as you're prepared to score it, is it?
But you're winning brownie points there.
But certainly the motivation's right. The intention's good at the very least, without doing an analysis of each of these particular...
I'd be willing to accept that the internal communication intention was good, and it seemed to be quite detailed in Mr. Harkin's report.
Okay, fine. And for completeness, whilst they were directed very internally to employees, they also went to politicians, to the department, to the CFA, all being part of this one source, one message, but making sure that those persons who were responsible for getting out the message had all of the information, including information from the mine, and you'd agree that's something they should do if they're going to adopt this one source, one message approach.
Well, communication with government and all authorities is absolutely essential, but I come back to my point that I was really only looking at some specific public communication aspects, and I'm very willing to accept it may well be the mine did an excellent job in those other areas of communication with government and its employees.
Well,
Excuse me, Mr. Reardon, not for external distribution up the top right-hand corner?
These particular ones were not for external distribution. They went to employees and they went to, as I say, politicians, a number of departments, the CFA, stakeholders, such persons. That wasn't for general distribution.
So some external.
Not external. Sorry.
It was not public.
No, it wasn't. They did not go public.
CFA, government, so forth, would be external to GDF, though.
Well, and that's what I'm saying. They went external to this, to the extent that they went to those particular stakeholders and critical message senders, but they weren't distributed.
The general public.
The general public, yes. And I was going to pick up on one thing that you said, Professor, and whilst you say you concentrate on public communications, the fact of the matter is, if you're communicating detail in a manner which you think is acceptable to 800 employees who live in the area, that is more than just an internal memo, isn't it? It's actually likely in a community like Morwell to get out into the community and to help educate the community as to things that are going on.
I accept that those 800 employees are certainly members of the community, yes, but I think the community is 15,000 or so or more. So.
Oh yes, it's not that.
And direct communication is what we're also advocating.
Okay. And as you rightly point out, direct communication wasn't something undertaken by them, certainly not until, withdraw that. There was, of course, initially with the fire, once the incident controller got appointed, there was then a delay whilst they pulled into line behind the incident controller. But you are aware that by the 19th to the 20th of February, they felt the need to say something on their own behalf, presumably because they were sensing what you've identified, and that is that people were expecting the mine to have a greater presence and not to simply fall in behind Mr. Lapsley, I think Mr. Drummond, your report refers to, or it might have been yours, Professor, but that there was a perception that the mine was hiding behind Mr. Lapsley. Is that correct?
I don't know as Mr. Lapsley specifically, but not being visible to the general public is almost always interpreted, rightly or wrongly, by the public as not being involved, not participating, not supporting it, rightly or wrongly.
And one gets to this tension, doesn't one, between being behind a single message and to what extent you're able to project your own image and your own message meaningfully is something that really this needs to be better identified. Is that so?
Look, it is a tension. It's a very delicate balance, and that's why a lot of preparation and a lot of relationships in terms of how you'll handle things publicly have got to be worked out. I deal with companies that work across transnational borders and where other governments, but they still have to work out a way to be visible and protect the company publicly, even though you're in the hands of a foreign government. It can be done, but it is a tension.
And it can be done. There's a tension. It's a question of just getting it right, that you've got the right amount of image, but you're not sending out messages that may conflict, as we've seen already in evidence messages did during the course of this fire. So I think you'd agree with that.
Yes, but I mean, I still don't know that it helped when we had government authorities saying, you say you were working very closely, but government authorities were saying the smoke was sort of okay, don't leave, and we read that this is one of the most serious fire situations ever confronted at the Morwell mine.
Can we go to that then?
And so that's an alarming statement to the public that I think they could only interpret as this is really serious, and meanwhile some other departments are saying stay in your homes.
You gave evidence about that. Maybe if we could go to an excerpt 5 of Mr. Harkin's statement, please, where we'll see that reference.
It's probably the full page ad, is it?
Yes, it is.
I remember it.
Yes. And it's up there on the screen just so everybody can see it.
Paragraph 2.
Yes. And so can I suggest to you that the statement there, this is one of the most serious fire situations ever confronted at the Morwell mine, and GDF Suez Hazelwood is working closely with the CFA and MFB to extinguish smouldering mine faces as quickly as we can, is not necessarily inconsistent with the Chief Health Officer saying that you don't need to leave town. You disagree with that, do you?
I do. If it's one of the most serious mine fire guys have ever confronted at the Morwell mine. There's a lot of literature around on the internet about burning brown coal. There was comments starting to be made that this is going to burn for a long time. I think that had to be adding to community anxiety.
Can I suggest to you...
And I'm not blaming GDF for this. I'm saying at the same time a number of government agencies weren't responding quickly enough to public fear.
I'll only ask you one question about it because people can have their own views. It's about a matter about which minds can differ. But this is saying that which was the truth, and there's the evidence. This was the most serious fire that's ever occurred at Hazelwood or maybe any other mine in Australia. But what the Chief Health Officer was doing was talking about the effects of that fire on the community. There was no serious suggestion that the fire was likely to escape from the mine to affect the community. The problem became one of airborne substances, correct?
Well, that's a typical characteristic of brown coal fires.
Yes.
Things escape.
They do. Anyway, you considered that when they did put their toe in the water, they sent a message which was inconsistent by telling the truth and being open.
No, I commented on that in the context of some inconsistency between departments and different messages the public were getting, which we made. And so that may well be the truth, but at the same time you're receiving that, I mean, maybe the criticism's more at the government departments who are saying everything's okay here.
Except that might be the truth too. The Chief Health Officer may well have been right in saying that, yes, there's a fire there, but the airborne matter is not such as should require you to consider evacuating.
It could well be correct. They both could be correct, but we're talking about human communication here. That's my concern.
So you would say, though, it may well have been better for them not to come out openly and tell the truth there because it may have concerned people who are listening to the Chief Health Officer, for example, at the same time.
Well, I know you asked me would I rewrite the statement. The question could be, what is the point of saying it's one of the most serious mine fires if you're addressing the public, which this was, it was a newspaper advertisement, and if you feel it's not a matter of public concern, why put it in there? To me, it seems to be alarming.
I thought it was your open and truthful approach to it, Professor, that you wanted them to do.
Well,
don't downplay it.
Public communication is talking about matters of concern to the public. And you're just saying to me that the fact that it's a serious fire in the mine doesn't mean it's a problem for the public. I'm saying talk about the matters of concern to the public, and the internal matters talk about them internally. So perhaps I'm being semantic, but I'm coming back to this issue of communication and the interpretation of the community versus the internal workings of the company.
And I think you're also critical, aren't you, of the next paragraph where they say we fully understand the inconvenience and concern that the smoke of the fire has caused people for people living in surrounding areas. You're critical of that too, aren't you?
I was mildly critical of that because it's the only statement I found of any sort of empathy or compassion, and inconvenience is the first word expressed. The community that I read and had listened to were talking more than inconvenience. So there was a perception issue here, I think.
Okay. And when you say it's the only one, it's a repeated theme in the ads, is it not?
I think the exact words were repeated, right?
And then they go on, and so what you would have rewritten that and said health concerns or health issues and sorry. How would you have done it?
I would have to give thought to how I'd write those words, but the sort of case studies suggest that organisations usually lead with a statement of public support, and the word inconvenience is probably a little bit weak. It's a bit more than inconvenience, I think people were feeling. So I think that the phrase could have been clearer, stronger, and if the fact that it's the most serious mine fire is not the public issue, then talk about what the public issue is.
Okay. And their statement that they're working hard to resolve the fire and reduce the level of smoke as quickly as we can, that's okay, I presume?
It's all good.
Okay.
I'm not actually saying there's focusing only on that particular issue. I'm saying there just wasn't enough. There was missing elements of communication as much or more that I'm criticising what was said.
Yes, all right. Well, we're just dealing with this at the moment. And then they go on and deal with a number of specific topics. Now, they would be, I suggest to you, topics of concern, current status of the fire, what caused the fire, how it was able to spread. They were matters of genuine concern within the community which had been identified by the mine. It was appropriate for them to address, was it not?
They are matters of concern, yes.
And it was appropriate for them to address in this way.
Yes, I believe so.
This is a good way to address it too, isn't it? Not the only way, but a good way to address it is to put in the local paper an advertisement where they can control the message rather than a press release, and would have very good penetration into the community.
As courteously as I can say, we seem to be going around in circles though, because I can accept, even if I said it was a perfectly good advertisement, it doesn't take away the comment that I was making. This same company has not been present at 2 public meetings that have occurred before this. And that's a very strong, visible, symbolic signal to the community. That is communication. The ad came later.
And in fact, they do address that in this.
Yes, the last part, I think, addresses why they weren't there.
And they address issues such as carbon monoxide, which I think Mr Drummond identified as being one of the issues that was floating around the community. A good thing for the mine to address as well, wasn't it? Matter of concern within the community?
Are you asking that to me?
Maybe Mr Lockley.
I've listened to the last few minutes, and my sense here is that having listened and paid great attention to all the community consultations, if the community believed that GDF Sewers communications were good, that would have come out in the community consultations. I didn't hear that in the community consultations, and the consultations, which I take as being a good indicator of the mood of the community, suggest that GDF Sewers was noticeably absent. So we can look at this piece of information and say, well, it's addressing a range of issues and we think those issues are appropriate, and I accept all of that. I make the point that the community, based on my analysis of it, would probably disagree.
And my question, of course, was a different one. My question was more limited, just that you identified carbon monoxide as an issue, and it's an appropriate thing for the mine to be addressing, however well they've addressed it at other times. You'd agree with that?
Yes,
proposition?
absolutely. Yeah.
And dealing more generally, do you agree that the concern that you identified in the community about GDF Sewers was principally about the fact that they were not prominent enough, particularly in the early stages?
Yes,
I agree with that?
Yes.
And you would accept that that may well be the result of GDF Sewers, considering that the one source, one message policy required them to subordinate their position to the incident controller. Whether or not they should have done that or not,
yeah, well, whether or not
agree with that?
Yeah, whether or not they should have done it is a matter can be debated into the future. I understand how.
As a matter of this inquiry, may well be able to make some recommendations about how it might be handled. Yes. To deal with the tension. You would agree with the professor that there is a real tension there between that one message and companies trying to impress upon their local community that they are in fact engaged with the problem.
Yeah,
there is a tension there, and I think we've acknowledged it. And
that's why I was addressing it to Mr Drummond on this occasion.
Sorry.
See whether he agreed with you as well.
Yes, I think I acknowledge that there is the potential for that tension. That is, if I understand this correctly, that GDF Sewers wants to adopt the subordination approach and the one source, one message approach, and that potentially doesn't align with the needs of the community. And if that's what you're referring to by tension, then I accept that.
Yeah, okay. Now, and I wasn't proposing to take you to all the advertisements because obviously they're progressive and they deal with updates, and I presume you didn't, apart from what you've identified, you didn't have any other problem with the regular advertisements that came through from Hazelwood Mine in the newspaper after that time?
No specific problems, no.
The critical issue that you come back to is the fact that there were 2 public meetings which they didn't attend.
That was one of the issues, but I think we've also commented on, and it is a professional opinion, that the Revive Morwell project campaign, we've also commented on that it was inappropriate in some respects to me.
We'll come to that too.
You asked me was it the only one, so no, it's not the only one.
Yes, okay, thank you, that's quite right. So, in that case then, the issue that there arises, and I'm wondering, is there any actual learning on this question? I'll ask you to assume for these purposes that the company is following the one source, one message approach and recognises this as being, with respect to health, a matter about which they don't have any sensible input. But when tossing up whether or not they should attend, whether they'll be concerned by the prospect that people may well expect them then to respond to questions and to speak, and whether or not they may cause greater aggravation by deferring to the LAPSLI and the CFA generally than absence. Whether absence of body in this sense might be presence of mind. Do you have a view about, is there any learning on that is my question?
Well, I think there's a lot of learnings for everybody, and I do point out, may I, in our supplementary report, Lockton and I made a particular note that while noting that GDF Sewer's public communication was deficient in some aspects, we go on to point out that government departments and authorities have the primary responsibility. So we do acknowledge a number of aspects of what you're saying, but I can only go back to my own professional experience as well, and that is every time there's a crisis, the company needs to protect its own reputation, and to some extent you may have been victim of certain policies and certain protocols, and that is you've got to be visible. That's just a fundamental principle. Now, you can handle that meeting because I've done it, and that is you stand alongside and you negotiate with the government authorities to say, we want to be there and we want to be alongside you. On matters of health, etc., we will immediately refer to you and say, we can't comment, but we support these authorities. We are working with them, and say that to the community. Be visible, be available.
Well, and I'll just ask one more question about this, though. How do you handle a position where you have potentially very concerned members of the community who want you to answer things with respect to the fire, where you consider that you're subordinated to the position of the CFA? And then, is there any learning on what the reaction of those people are when you say, well, really, we're just going to be deferring to what the CFA says about that?
I find if meetings are well chaired and well coordinated, the chair can say to the public on matters of health, it is the Department of Health that are the experts. On the matters of fighting the fire, the CFA. On matters to do with the company or its preparation or what it's doing are questions for you. And the chair I don't think the public has a problem with that. Okay. It does require coordination by the others and the government agencies to work with you.
Maybe a good understanding of your local community too.
Absolutely.
And how they're likely to respond.
Yes.
On that topic, there was some mention, I think, in both your reports about understanding Morwell. Just speaking for the human faces of my client, who are residents of Morwell, presumably you would defer to their judgment, much as it was at the time, as to what was appropriate for Morwell, being residents of Morwell.
Yes. I would think the government departments should have listened to community groups and probably your people as well. You are the locals. Yeah. I would support that.
Your comments were related to the people coming from outside.
I grew up in a small country town, and I know when a guy in a suit pops in from Melbourne or Sydney, I know what the locals think. Sorry.
I wonder if they're thinking it now, Professor.
I took my tie off.
Okay.
I think in your defence, Mr. Reardon, you grew up in a country town.
We called it a provincial city. Same place as the Chief Health Officer, by chance. That's better. Professor, if I could take you back possibly to your conclusions, because you do, at page 42 of your statement, I wanted to make a couple of comments. The first bullet point, just to make it perfectly clear, it is true that the media releases commenced really at the stage when the fire was at least under control, was when the company took media releases, but you acknowledge that prior to that there was public communication through the advertisements, as we've discussed. So it wasn't their first dalliance into public communication, correct?
True.
And the second one is no expression of regret, concern, empathy or compassion. Again, we've dealt with it. They've said they've got concern and they understand. There was some expression, you say it probably didn't go far enough, correct?
Yes, and we've levelled that criticism at government agencies as well.
Yes. And then the next bullet point goes to the revived Morwell, which was the provision of the $100 vouchers, and you're critical of that. Let me first say to you, you would accept that your criticism about that is really quite subjective.
It is based on experience and some research, though.
All right. But if the big issue in the town at the end of the fire, not during the fire, as I think Mr. Lockwood referred to, at the end of the fire is this town is suffering by reason of the aftermath of the fire, and the businesses are suffering, you would agree it's a perfectly appropriate thing for an industry such as the mine to attempt to inject some money back into the shops and the commercial heart of the town. You'd agree with that? Perfectly appropriate thing.
I believe that I've said that in my report, that as an economic gesture, and particularly to the businesses of Morwell, $670,000 is a significant amount of money. But my position would be that mostly benefits local business, and that's an important sector. But $100 in the hands of the residents isn't really a lot of money, and so to me it was a very good business initiative, I would think, but less so with the public.
Well, can I suggest to you that, with respect, your analysis fails to understand that the public are concerned about the businesses of their town, and that therefore, whilst $100 is plainly token in one sense, it was always intended to be for the purposes of promoting business. It was never for the purposes of providing compensation. Would you agree with that proposition?
If it's, to an extent, but I just think, again, I come back to the public perception of it. It is a relatively small amount of money. I think you had to spend it within a week. You had to spend it on local businesses. And yes, I've noted that it's a significant amount of money into the economy, but as a, Revive Morwell's Economy might be a good title for the logo, which could be redesigned. But I'm not sure it revives moral spirits or moral citizens, etc. So I was criticised, and it's dangerous to play with money in crisis. I usually warn clients, don't offer money; it could backfire. Offer to clean their houses for nothing, or give them something tangible directly related to the problem. That was it is somewhat subjective.
You're thinking about compensation.
No.
Well, you actually talk about it, don't you, in your first hyphen in that bullet point. $100 per household is a relatively small amount of money for families who report potentially serious physical health effects, as well as substantial mental health concerns caused by stress and anxiety during the crisis. Are you not relating the money there to the suffering that they've caused?
One can always improve one's words, but I was relating an amount of money to mental and physical issues. People were upset, people were concerned, people are worried. And offering money usually has they're worried about their rainwater tanks are unusable or whatever, and people can, I didn't use the word compensation at all, and people can be worried that that's sort of somehow buying them off, whereas coming and cleaning their house or cleaning their rainwater tank might be more of a solution for them. But I hadn't given detailed thought to what should be done. I pointed out offering an amount of money is probably not how most crisis communication experts would advise the company.
Okay. You then seem to make a criticism of the spokesman on the basis of what he's quoted as saying in the newspaper on the 17th of February. If I could just show you what that article was, and I presume you saw it, but if you can have a look at this, the article. to suggest to you that there's more copies available if you'd like, and the original, but I think we did the original. Was it intended to be a criticism of Mr. Rowe that you put that, the fact that he was quoted as he was?
No, it was pointing out, I was looking for where the mine was, where the public was reading something from the mine, and when they did in this particular case, and Mr. Rowe might have been severely edited by journalists, I don't know, but he was talking about the internal workings of the mine. When the anger being expressed at meetings was all about their effects in the town and the ash and so forth. So in a way it was the wrong audience. If you're talking in the local newspaper, a lot of people would have been like, I don't care about the mine right now, I'm worried about my house.
Yeah, perfectly reasonable point, but it's the difficulty of controlling the media, isn't it?
Yes, I accept that.
And Mr. Rowe says that what happened was that he was rung up and said, tell us what's the state of the fire at the moment. As a good media point of contact, he replied, and then they quoted right down the end of a story, which is really principally about carbon monoxide.
Yeah.
And his comment, of course, is unrelated. So
I accept that happens.
Accepting that it's not the way the mine would like it to go forward as a representation of their concerns, you've got limited control over the press.
You do. That's why you've got to get everything else right.
Yes. But it is a reason why in these circumstances the full-page advertisements do have the advantage that you can present it, for better or for worse, the way you want to present it.
Yes, they do.
And they also, do they not indicate to the people, when you do an ad of that size, there's some level of concern within the mines about the predicament that's engulfed the community?
Yes.
Can I then ask you about, you mentioned the long statement of George Graham, which is in fact, when they put the ads in, they then put them on, each of them on the website,
yep. Which
again you would say was an appropriate thing to do to reach further audience, correct?
Yes.
And plainly enough, you make a comment towards the bottom of 45 saying you have to use a certain search function, but you would accept that these things get updated and moved around on the website. So the fact that when you were looking it was difficult to find wouldn't indicate that it was difficult to find at the time when it was released.
Look, most people these days make sure they've got a permanent record of all of their statements and keep them archived, and so I would say that's just probably not best practice technique of keeping all your archive statements there for a record.
Not much to do with crisis management, but just generally good recording.
It's just good communication.
Yes.
And certainly in a crisis, though, I'd like to give a copy of every statement I've written to show that.
Could, Mr. Chairman, could I tender that copy of the news report?
Yes.
It could be part of the statement of the Professor. He does refer to it.
Yes, but it was treated as part, as linked to the report.
Thank you.
Part of exhibit 50.
On a similar topic, Professor, on page 46, and you put this in the section where you're dealing with the mine company, you comment or commence the comments by saying, while media reporting cannot be taken as always accurate and fair,
Yes.
or fully representative of all views, a major editorial in Victoria's leading newspaper, The Age, claimed that there does not seem to be any sense of urgency in dealing with the Hazelwood open coal mine fire. And you then attach the relevant editorial. The section that you referred to, apart from being highlighted at the end, in fact is about a third of the way down the middle column, is it not?
If you say it is, yes.
My question was really how this, no, I'll withdraw that, this article or editorial is really all about a criticism, it would appear, of Chief Health Officer and other health authorities not acting promptly enough with respect to the air quality. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I mean, looking at my report, this was in the very final stages of editing. I would accept that editorial does not only relate, it is actually in the section related to GDF sewers, and it actually relates to the whole. It probably needs a subheading of summary above it. So
that's all. That was the simple point I was asking.
Yes,
you can see this is really not directed to the mine at all, is it? It's directed to the regulatory authorities not responding promptly enough to the health issues in Morwell. It's not a suggestion that certainly that the fire, they weren't trying hard enough to put out the fire or anything like that.
No.
Okay. Mr. Lockwood, I think most of the issues that Drummond, I'm sorry, Mr. Drummond, most of the issues that I dealt with the professor really more than covers what were this content of your report about GDF sewers, which is really on page 19 of your report, part 6.4.5. That's where you deal with GDF sewers.
Yep.
And you've already made reference to the comment by one Morwell resident, but you also focused on their failure to attend the meetings. Mm. So your recommendation should be that there should be clearer guidelines which make it plain that in these crisis management, the one source, one message should still permit companies to be present and maybe even present to enable them to...
And that's why in this particular paragraph I use words like appeared to show a lack of commitment and responsibility. The perception among the community, and based on my analysis, the community consultation supports that.
Yes, nonetheless, much of your opinion highlighted problems that arise as a result of inconsistent messages. You agree that's a priority to avoid?
Yes.
Yeah. And you'd agree with the professor, would you, that even if the public who attended a public meeting were of the view that the mine wasn't as forthcoming about certain issues where they had to defer to the CFO, your view would be that would serve them better than being absent?
Yes. Avoiding inconsistent messages doesn't preclude them being engaged at these meetings.
But it may preclude them in saying all they want to say.
Yes, but I'd refer to Jim's point there, which is a managed, run meeting.
Throws it out.
Yeah.
A well-managed, well-run meeting in the course of a fire in Morwell may be a bit more challenging, can I suggest to you. Thank you. No further questions.
Mr. Reardon, may I just, could you remind me where the one source, one message policy sits?
Yes, we have it in certain... Obviously, it's in the evidence of Commissioner Lapsley, and I can give you the transcript. And there is, in fact, a document to that effect, is there not? And it's also part... I'll allow the Council assistant. Thank you very much. I'm
assist liberally today. It's in paragraph 150 of Mr. Lapsley's first statement, where he says, following the 2009 bushfires, Victoria introduced an integrated warning system based on the principle of one source, one message. This provides warnings to communities through such means as the emergency broadcasters, websites, social media channels, the Fire Ready mobile application, the Victorian Bushfires Information Line, and the National Emergency Alert Telephone Warning System. Thank you.
Can I also suggest that transcript 129, he elaborated on that on day one, page 129, line 26 onwards.
Professor McNamara, your expertise is in communications, that's right. You have no expertise in emergency management per se.
No.
And same position with you, Mr. Drummond. You're not in a position to second guess any decision taken by any of the incident controllers or any of the commanders of the secondary response agencies, are you?
I think the answer has to be no. I mean, I've worked with those sort of people in the past, but not in this case.
You talk about, Professor, you talk about the community, indeed both of you do. You talk about community perceptions if it's a unified voice, but indeed it's not a unified voice, is it? You agree with that?
That's true.
What it is really, it's a collection of individual responses by people. That's right.
Yes.
I'm not sure I'd agree with that proposition.
But they form common patterns.
Right,
when analysing community consultations, I look for convergent validity. And what I mean by that is I won't put one quote in a report if it's only been said by one person. I'm looking for consistency of opinion before I give it sufficient weight to put it in the report.
Consistency of opinion of those that responded?
Of those that were at the community consultations, as well as the other matters and material I looked at.
Many people didn't go to community consultations.
I accept that.
People are far more likely to be vocal if they have a complaint about something, and if they wish to commend it. You'll agree with that?
Yes, if you're saying it's a self-selected audience or there's a selection bias, that is, those who are more opinionated are more likely to attend those meetings, which is the point I think you're making.
It's reasonable to presume that there will be some people in the community that had sufficient access to information.
Sorry,
it's reasonable to presume that there are people in this community that had sufficient access to the information.
As a general statement, yes.
Professor, you said that you had a difficulty with the word unprecedented, which has been used by several people, and you said this wasn't unprecedented. I suggest to you that it being the largest fire in more than 100 years of the operation of the mine, burning for 45 days and involving 7,000 firefighters, it was absolutely unprecedented in scale. You don't refute that?
It was unprecedented by the literal meaning in Australia. So yes. It's not unprecedented if you look internationally. But the point we went on to make is whether you use the literal meaning of unprecedented, it was foreseeable.
Well, they mean different things, don't they?
They do, and the foreseeability, though, is the issues that should inform planning, not whether there's a precedent. We haven't been hit by a meteorite yet, but that doesn't mean we wouldn't plan evacuation.
There was considerable plans in relation to emergency management. You accept that?
Yes.
Professor, you, indeed both of you, in the last dot point on your joint paper, timing and tailoring, perhaps I'll direct the question to you, Mr. Drummond. You understand there was never an announcement for evacuation?
Sorry, let me just find that. Could I just
interrupt? I know it's making a difference, but there's an urgency in relation to the plane that's going to take Professor McNamara away, and could I ask you to direct as many as possible the questions that are appropriate to him ASAP?
Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm embarrassed, but it is an international connection.
Oh, yes, I understand. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Perhaps I'll address this question to you then, Professor Drummond. Do you understand there was never an announcement requiring evacuation?
I understand it was a temporary relocation directive issued.
Yes, well, do you understand it was the Chief Health Officer recommended that people in a particular part of Morwell relocate?
Yes.
And it's suggested that in your joint paper, the last sentence, given the situation had not changed, the date and timing seemed arbitrary. Are you not aware of the basis on which the Chief Health Officer issued that recommendation on the 28th of February? Are you not aware of the situation that had changed?
Probably not. I'm not.
Not in great detail, but the reason we make this point here is that that's the community's perception.
Yes, well, you don't say that the community perception has changed, Mr. Drummond. What you say is, given the situation had not changed, do you think there might be some information that you haven't had access to?
It's possible,
but that was not communicated.
Yes. Does the fact that the Chief Health Officer made that recommendation on the basis of a spike in the level of particulate matter, PM2.5, the day before. Then, sorry, on the 27th, there had been a spike and it had got up to the dangerous level, and that was that spike that precipitated her decision on the 27th, communicated on the 28th, to advise people to relocate in a particular area.
That may be true. I have no knowledge. I'm thinking she had it on the 27th. Does it need 24 hours even to issue that?
And I'd suggest there were other spikes too. And significant spikes that might have warranted making such a relocation earlier.
I see. So you're second-guessing the Chief Health Officer about that, are you? No. With regard to... You criticised, Mr Drummond, the smoke advisories. You said there were too many. I think you said there were over 100 from the EPA. Is that right?
Yeah, I may have that number wrong, but yes.
Yeah, indeed there was 68.
Okay. I still stand by that
I
statement.
counted 76, but
yes.
Some of them had different titles.
Yes. You say too many.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there a position that you can be damned if you do and damned if you don't? You're nodding, Professor?
Yeah, there is.
Yes, thank you.
I mean, these things are difficult, and that's why we keep coming back to you've got to work dynamically with the community. I mean, you'd like me to say it was all perfect. It clearly wasn't. People are upset. People didn't understand things. So clearly we can do better.
No dynamic situation involving 7,000 firefighters is going to be perfect, is it?
No.
Professor, government agencies, you accept the government agencies were not the only groups communicating with the public during this incident?
Yes, they were primary sources though.
Yes. There's often disparate parts of the community that may want to advocate a particular point specific to that group. You accept that some people during the course of the incident want to advocate a particular point?
That happens in all cases, yes.
People in different groups may source information from another jurisdiction, for argument's sake, which is inconsistent with the circumstances at Hazelwood. Do you accept that?
Yes.
For argument's sake, the makeup of brown coal is very different in the United States than it is in the Latrobe Valley. Do you understand that?
I believe so, yes.
People reading that the makeup of brown coal and coal fires in the United States might have a very alarmist view about what's in that particular smoke, and it might be very different to what's in the smoke in the Latrobe Valley. Do you accept that?
I do, but it has to be explained to the community if that's the case. And I can't comment about these technical issues. All I know is a lot of people didn't seem to understand those things. And if there are dissenting voices in the community, that's where we come back to you need clear, trusted sources speaking out and working with the community.
When people source their own information, sometimes that leads to a proliferation of rumour and misinformation on social media.
It does in everything, and it did in the Queensland floods as well.
That makes the task of giving a unified and coherent message all the more difficult. That's right?
Yes, and it requires good communication skills, extremely good communication planning and skills.
Yes. All these things heighten the risk that the message being received by the community is a mixed one.
Yes.
That is, information is coming from different groups. So that's why the one source, one message, if it can be achieved, is the best course, isn't it?
Well, the one source, one message is a government policy. I've already said I think having single authoritative sources can work, but one message, I think what they mean is consistency on message on particular issues. There's more than one message to be put across.
There's no single template for effective communication, is there?
No.
And indeed, where a particular community has undergone certain disadvantages, it's even harder to have a single template for effective communication, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes. Nothing further. Thank you.
I have no re-examination. May Professor McNamara and Mr Drummond be excused.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your consideration.
I've given a commitment to Brooke Burke, the community witness for today, that she'll be on it too, so that she can manage her 10-week-old baby. But we thought it might be useful to at least start Marita Tabane's evidence before lunch, so that she can adopt her statement and we can deal with the preliminaries.
I call Marita Tabane.
Please state your full name.
Marita Lucia Tobane.
Please repeat after me. I do solemnly and sincerely declare and affirm.
I do solemnly and sincerely declare and affirm.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
To this Board of Inquiry.
To this Board of Inquiry.
Will be the truth.
Will be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Good afternoon, Mr. Bain. Can you please confirm for the transcript your full name?
Marita Lucia Tobane.
It's Tobane spelled Tabain.
That's correct.
And Mr. Bain, you hold the position of Director Media and Corporate Communications with the Victoria Police?
Yes, I do.
To use the language of the public service, that's your substantive position?
Yes, it is.
Is that right? But you're here today wearing a different hat. You're the chair of the Emergency Management Joint Public Information Committee.
Yes.
MJPIC.
That's right.
Right. Bit of a debate about whether that's an acronym as such, but it's certainly well known as MJPIC.
Yes.
And you've held the position with the Victoria Police since May 2012, is that right?
Yes.
And with that position comes the role of chair of MJPIC. And does that mean we understand you've held both those roles since you started with the Victoria Police in May 2012?
That's correct.
Now, for the purposes of the inquiry, you've made a witness statement dated the 27th of May 2014.
Yes.
And have you read through a copy of that statement before coming along to give evidence today?
Yes.
Okay. And there are a couple of changes that you'd like to make
Yes.
to the statement. So the first of those in paragraph 4 on the first page. Would you like to delete, excuse me, the words by convention at the beginning of that sentence and replace them with the words under the Emergency Management Manual Victoria?
Yes.
And the other change relates to a date of a meeting.
Paragraph 110.
It's paragraph
110.
110, thank you, on page 22 of the statement. You there refer to a meeting which we've already heard quite a bit about today and which I will ask you about later at the Kerno Hall in Morwell. You've described it as having taken place on the evening of Wednesday, the 18th of February 2014. Do you wish to change that to Tuesday?
Yes, I do.
The 18th of February. With those changes, are the contents of your statement true and correct?
Yes, they are.
I'll tender the statement together with 2 volumes of attachments.
53.
Right. A little bit about your background, Ms. Tobane. Your qualifications are a Bachelor of Arts degree from Monash University.
Yes.
Do you have any... Sorry, I'll withdraw that. Was there any particular part of that degree that dealt with communications issues?
No.
No. Do you have any qualifications or training relating specifically to communications over and above your BA?
I was a journalist for a number of years and moved into communications. So I've actually worked in the field for around 28 years.
Right, I will ask you about that. Perhaps we can start with your time as a journalist. How long did you work as a journalist?
A long time ago now, probably about 8 or 9 years.
All right. And then after that, you've held several communications positions within government departments. Is
Yes.
that right? So you, for 3 years, I'm looking at paragraph 6 of your statement. For 4 years, you were the Executive Director of Strategic Communications, Department of Innovation, Industry and Regional Development.
Yep.
And you've also held the position of General Manager, Communications and Marketing at Sustainability Victoria. All of that preceded your current role, which is with Victoria Police.
Yep.
Now, a little bit about MJPIC, if we could. Paragraph 13, you describe MJPIC as a committee of media and communications representatives from emergency and related agencies who work to ensure the most appropriate information is released during an emergency through media and communications channels. And you go on, in application, this is done by taking advice from the relevant agencies in government who are tasked with managing the events. It's important to appreciate for the inquiry what the role of MJPIC is. It's essentially a coordinating committee.
In effect, and coordinates and guides.
It doesn't have staff as such.
No.
No. You make that point at paragraph 56. And just perhaps we can complete that at paragraph 57 of your statement on page 9. You identify the foremost responsibility of MJPIC. We'll do everything we can to assist you. And we'll get back. I'm sorry, Mr. Maid. You describe the foremost responsibility of MJPIC as to ensure that public information is coordinated and distributed in a timely and accurate manner to inform and advise community members during a major emergency, as well as ensuring media needs are met through a coordinated multi-agency approach. You're happy to adopt that description, I take it?
Yes.
I'm interested in the word coordinated. You've been in the hearing room throughout this morning when there's been some discussion about perceived lack of coordination between agencies in providing messages, and that's certainly been a theme through the course of the inquiry. How, in a practical sense, did MJPIC seek to coordinate the messages during the course of this year's fire?
So during this fire, we met daily, sometimes twice daily, as I've mentioned in my statement.
Yes.
And we would discuss issues, be it media issues, plans, things that were coming up. So in terms of the coordination, we would start every meeting with a feedback on what the situation was physically down here in Morwell. We would seek feedback from the council when they came on board, and from CFA and people situated at the ICC on what was occurring and what the feedback was from the community. And then we would discuss what the plans were for different agencies. So as issues with the EPA and their monitoring came up as issues around different levels, had that fed into what the decision making being made by the Department of Health, also then with the CFA and with Commissioner Lapsley, those messages, and there could often be 3 different things that would need to be communicated: levels of air quality, situation, health and wellbeing situation for the community from the Department of Health, and the fire situation. How we actually brought those 3 together in a way that didn't clash, that weren't contradictory, as best we could bring them together, either bring them together in joint media conferences, which occurred quite regularly, or ensure that they didn't. We didn't have 2 on the one day. That one occurred maybe one day, one the next, that sort of thing.
Right. Do you think, looking back on the communications that emerged during February and March, that you were successful in coordinating the messages?
I think in the main we were. It was a difficult and complex situation we were in.
Yes.
It was not like a simple fire, and I know there's been reference to that through the day. A fire starts, everyone stands up and stands down. This was a situation that evolved and changed. And I think in the main, we did coordinate our messages. We were able to distribute information through the different channels that we were using. Everyone was more or less working from the same pieces of information. Over the period, was there possibly once or twice that didn't quite work? Absolutely, maybe there was, but I think in the main we were successful in that.
I'm thinking specifically of some evidence, and I think you would have seen it, the 2 communications on the 28th of February that were up on the screen today, where you've got Dr. Lester giving a very significant piece of advice to the community about relocation, and you've got the EPA putting out a release shortly afterwards on the same day dealing with similar issues, but making no reference to that advice having come out. Do you see how there might be a perception there's a lack of coordination in the
on
messages.
that day, and with that example, yes, I do.
Okay. Now, I want to ask you a little bit about preparedness, and I've noticed that it's 3 minutes to 1, rather than perhaps starting on a new topic.
If you go to another topic, yes, it may be the appropriate time to.
Just one question, Mr. Rosen, on structure and I guess disseminating the information. So it's around, I think the topic was around coordination. May I ask Mr. Bain about how internally those messages then were up to the individual agencies, were they, to disseminate those key messages? And I'm talking, for example, about how the members of the CFA responded to the community in their information trucks, or whatever you call those, the vans. How were they? Whose role was it to ensure that the key messages filtered, I'll say all the way down, but I don't mean that disrespectfully, across?
So what we would do, and throughout, so we had our meetings, and throughout the day, as things would change, the different agencies would send through updates of information. So if, for example, Department of Health had an update on their health messaging, they would send it into the Secretariat, so into us, and that would be disseminated throughout the group, so that everyone at every point would have the same information. And that some of those emails, there were a number of emails throughout the day. So there were days when there were 4 or 5 emails sent around to everyone who was on, in particular, the MJPIC that was around Hazelwood itself. It was because things were changing consistently. They were changing all the time. It was a challenge for us, and the best we felt we could do was actually keep that information flowing. And then it was up to the agencies to actually disseminate that to the people who are doing the engagements.
Okay, we'll resume at 2 o'clock.
Thank you, sir.
All stand.